Capitol Police are always there protecting this building, particularly as we've noted on more than one occasion in this coverage since January 6th and the insurgency that we saw surround the Capitol, break into the Capitol building. Police have been in a heightened state of awareness as a result of that. Monica Alba continues to watch the developments here with me. Monica, what more can you add?
Aaron, so in the nature of these fast developing situations, the U.S. Capitol Police is offering a correction to their own tweet about the location. So just wanted to make sure that viewers are aware this didn't occur along Independence Avenue, as the U.S. Capitol Police had said in their tweet. It was along Constitution Avenue. Some very keen, eagle-eyed viewers who know these shots in terms of what our camera is showing may have noticed that as well. So that is important to note. But some additional really key context here from my colleague Frank Thorpe, who is a Capitol Hill reporter, to also just add to this a little bit. That barrier that you see there when the car has been stopped by it is something that is always up. It's really only taken down when Capitol Police officers at the gate clear each individual vehicle. So that's an important point in terms of this car. They go through that barrier and then they would be swept by another set of officers who then puts down another set of barriers before they're even allowed closer and onto the Capitol grounds. So this car in particular, that blue vehicle we were showing you a few moments ago, was 2 barriers away from getting to the actual Capitol building that you're seeing there. So that is some key context in terms of where this gate was and where this occurred, really a lot closer to that perimeter fence than to actually getting closer to it. But since we've seen these perimeters really move as the security posture has been adjusted in the last couple of months, it's important to say that at least this car somehow did break through at least one barrier or was somehow
Monica, I'm going to interrupt you here now at
questions
NBC News Special Report.
This is an NBC News Special Report. Here's Kristen Welker.
Good day, everyone. We are coming on the air with breaking news out of Washington, where the U.S. Capitol complex is on lockdown and people outside have been advised to take cover after what officials call an external security threat, apparently a car ramming a barricade outside the Capitol. Now, shots have been fired. Our Pete Williams has been following this story and has the very latest developments of this ongoing breaking news. Pete, what can you tell us?
Kristen, the best information we have is that this is on the Senate side, the Constitution Avenue side of the U.S. Capitol, where this temporary fence was set up and a barricade was erected to keep cars that had to go through a checkpoint. And a short time ago, a little less than an hour ago, that blue car that you're looking at ran past the barricade and would not stop, hit 2 U.S. Capitol Police officers, injuring them, and then we're told by 2 different law enforcement officials that the person in the car jumped out of the car with a knife and was then shot by U.S. Capitol Police. So we know of 3 people injured, the driver of the car who was shot, the 2 U.S. Capitol Police officers who were struck by the car. All 3 have been taken to the hospital. We're told that the injuries of one of the Capitol Police officers is considered critical. We don't know the condition of either the driver of the car or the other Capitol Police officer. And we don't know anything about what this person's motive was, what the background was, where they came from. It would seem to be more than just an accident if the person jumped out with a knife. But you see the sort of double barricade there. The lower right portion of your screen is the temporary fence that is what's left now of what was originally put around the Capitol after the January 6th riots in the Capitol. And then you see the more permanent structure, which is that pop-up barricade that says stop there where the car is struck. That's obviously what stopped the car. So it went through the checkpoint, which is right above the word police on your screen, where the Capitol Police officers were checking anybody who wanted to get further toward the Capitol complex. And that's the Senate side of the Capitol that you see in the upper left of the screen. And then the car kept going, and these pop-up barricades are down below even with the street, and that normal traffic can pass, but they pop up to stop traffic. And normally they are in the up position they are lowered to let cars through. So the car hit that, and we're told the driver jumped out with a knife. We don't know of any other injuries, and as I say, Kristen, this just happened within the past hour, and so we're still learning much more minute by minute.
And, Pete, as you point out, there are already extra barricades all around the Capitol in the wake of what happened on January 6th. Do we have any sense that investigators are concerned about any ongoing threat, or at this point, does it seem as though that driver in the car is it? I think
the honest answer to that question is they don't know yet. They don't know much about the driver. This just happened. I have no other information to indicate there's any other threat. This does seem to be, quote unquote, over. But I think it's just too soon to say whether this is isolated or what else is going on here. We just don't have those answers yet.
Yeah, the investigation just unfolding as we are talking. I want to go now to Leanne Caldwell, who is on the phone. She has additional details. She covers Capitol Hill for us and is overlooking what is transpiring right now. Leanne, set the scene for us. The Capitol, as Pete and I have been discussing, already has had extra protection in the wake of what happened on January 6th. What are you seeing right now?
Well, that's right, Kristen. There is extra protection, and that's why you see that black fencing in your screen. With the fencing was put up after January 6th. That's what's called some of the perimeter fencing. And then there was another layer of fencing that went much broader that was actually taken down just 2 weeks ago. As you can see, there is a big huddle of law enforcement that's including police and Capitol Police, and there's National Guard there as well, lots of first responders. I'm in the Russell Senate office building, which is directly across the street from the Capitol. I'm on the third floor, but I'm about 100 yards away from where the scene is right now. And at about 1:03, we got an announcement that we were on lockdown because of an external situation. Shortly after, we heard sirens, many sirens, racing to the scene. And then shortly after that, there was a helicopter that landed on the grass on the east front of the Capitol. That helicopter has since taken off. But I can see very well the car that has crashed into that security barrier that is the final security barrier between the public and the Capitol. And those security barriers were actually put into place after September 11th. After every tragic security threat, there is more security that is put up around the Capitol, and that car barrier that the car is currently crashed into was a post-September 11th fix. And so that, as Pete Williams said, is usually up. I want to note that the Capitol is relatively empty at this time. It is Good Friday. The House and the Senate are both on their Easter recesses. They've been out all week. Members are in the district. There's not a lot of staff. Some staff aren't even coming in anyway because of COVID. So there's not too many people in danger at this point, but it is quite a tragic scene, especially after what this area and the people that work here have just been through after January 6th, Kristen.
Leanne, let me follow up with you on that point. You obviously have been going to the Capitol almost every day in the wake of January 6th, that assault against the U.S. Capitol when people stormed the seat of government, breached the seat of government, entered, threatened members of Congress, the then vice president. This has been an entire area that has been essentially on high alert to some extent. Can you set the scene for us, Leanne, what it has been like to be at the U.S. Capitol in the wake of January 6th and why this extraordinary event coming on the heels of all of that will only add to the urgency and, frankly, concerns?
Absolutely. Immediately after January 6th, people obviously were extremely rattled and scared. And that's when you saw the National Guard come in. That's when you saw this black fencing that you now see put up. And then, as I said, another layer put up. There was barbed wire on top of the black fencing. That has slowly started to be taken down. There has been, as time has passed since January 6th, there has been a sense that perhaps the security protocols and measures that have been put in place in the aftermath was too much, an overreaction. It had started to almost become a partisan event of the fact that of how much security should be in place. As time had passed, people started to feel more secure. The Capitol Police and law enforcement had said there was no specific direct threat that justified the extensive fencing. So they were in the middle of putting plans in place to do something that people could live with, perhaps not this very visual black, fence around the Capitol, but something different. Those plans were in place. But one thing that did continue to concern law enforcement and Capitol Police that I spoke to were these kind of, and I'm not saying that's what this is right now because we don't know yet, but these rogue operators, people, you look at the White House, Kristen, you know that there are sometimes just individuals who do pose security threats, and that is something that is continuously a challenge for Capitol Police as the overall threat people felt from, militia groups and others coming to the Capitol was lessening because there was no intelligence pointing to it at this point. So, as time has passed, people had started to feel more safe, but it was still becoming a very political and partisan thing where there's so many Democrats especially who wanted more security, wanted things to be continued in this way, while many Republicans in some instances were saying that House Speaker Nancy Pelosi was overreacted and needed to take things down. So this is going to perhaps very much change that dynamic once again, and the conversations around security, which weren't even complete in the aftermath of January 6th. In fact, just really beginning on what the long-term security structure should look like, especially since this is known as the People's House. Before COVID, flocks and flocks of tourists would come and tour the Capitol on a daily basis. We are in prime tourist season right now. The cherry blossoms are in peak bloom. There are tourists here, not as many, but usually those tourists are wandering the lawns of the Capitol, wandering the halls of the Capitol, and it has just not been that way.
Leanne, such incredible reporting. And for our viewers who are just joining us, let's just recap what it is that we are covering as we come on the air at this hour. A driver, as you see there, attempted to breach or ram into the U.S. Capitol building. According to our Pete Williams, two law enforcement officials are telling him that after striking two U.S. Capitol police officers, that driver jumped out of the car with a knife and was then shot by Capitol Police. 3 people taken to the hospital. Our Casey Hunt, who was there on January 6th as well, who has been tracking not just this story, but the developments in the wake of January 6th. And of course, we do not know if there is any connection at all between the two. This investigation is still very much in its early stages. But Casey has been there nearly every day as well. Casey, give us your sense of what is unfolding at this hour.
Well, Kristen, just to pick up on your recap here, you're looking at a car that rammed into a barrier in a driveway that leads to the United States Capitol. It's on the Senate side. It's important to know there are still 2 more sets of barriers before this car would have actually gotten to the Capitol. And these are barriers that are up at all times. They only come down if there is someone that's allowed to be driving through who needs to pass. And that's why there's multiples, because then they can raise the second one behind a car that's come in safely. So I think it's important to note that this is a security posture and measure that this was in place before January 6th. It will continue after January 6th. Now, of course, this car could not have gotten to where it was if all of the security surrounding the Capitol was still in the posture that was developed in the immediate aftermath of the insurrection, because for quite some time, there was no traffic allowed at all on Constitution Avenue. And for those who don't live in the nation's capital, but perhaps have been here to visit or have seen pictures of the Washington Monument, Constitution Avenue is one of those two wide avenues that span the National Mall on the north and the south sides. And Constitution on the north side. And if you were to continue going down the hill, eventually on your left, you'd see the Washington Monument, eventually the Lincoln Memorial. So that's where this car is. And for a time after the insurrection, a section of Constitution Avenue was shut to traffic. You couldn't drive on it. You couldn't drive anywhere inside that complex on any of those roads that you see on your screen right now if you didn't have a badge and a reason to be there. Now, they withdrew that because there is this importance, as Leanne was just talking about, and this feeling that this should be the people's house, that there shouldn't be these major roadblocks. These are major regular roads people commute on every day in Washington. Obviously, that's been dialed back because of the pandemic, but it was very significant that they were shut. And so it was deemed important that they be reopened. And so that's why this car was able to get even to the point where it is now. You mentioned Pete Williams' new reporting that these officers, the officers were struck by the car. The point I want to make about that as well is that the U.S. Capitol Police has just had the most difficult 2 to 3 months probably in the history of the outfit. They have been working overtime through weekends. They went through something incredibly traumatic. They were targeted on January 6th. And so to have something like this happen, to have 2 more of their own fallen, very, very significant blow to a force that already has been through so much. And if those officers were to have been struck by this car, keep in mind, they would not have had to be in between. And I'm sorry, Kristen, go ahead.
No, what a critical point that you raise. And I'm glad you give that perspective and that background about the difficult months that the Capitol Police officers have had. Pete Williams does have some new information. Casey, let me go back to him so that we can just get that quick update. Pete, what do you have?
So we're getting a little fuller picture here of what happened. The car ran the barricade, struck 2 officers. The driver jumped out with a knife and was shot. But before the driver was shot, we're told that the driver, the person with the knife, did attack one Capitol Police officer, potentially cutting that police officer in the face. And I don't know whether that is one of the 2 officers that were struck by the car or a third officer. So it's not clear to me yet whether we have 3 people injured here or 4, the driver plus certainly 2 Capitol Police officers and possibly a third. We're trying to get clarification on that now. As I said, all 3 of those, and potentially 4, but all those who were injured were taken to the hospital. The driver is in custody, but is in the hospital, Kristen.
Pete, as we've been saying, this investigation just getting underway. It is worth underscoring, Pete, we don't know anything about the motive yet at this hour, correct?
Correct. We know nothing about the driver.
All right. And just to recap quickly, again, a vehicle ramming into a barricade outside of the U.S. Capitol, injuring 2 U.S. Capitol police officers. We know the FBI also investigating. Our correspondents on Capitol Hill and, of course, the Justice Department also investigating, trying to get to the bottom of exactly what happened here. And we are going to continue to bring you updates throughout the day. At this hour, it appears as though 3 people have been taken to the hospital in the wake of this incident. We will have full details coming up on NBC Nightly News. For now, I'm Kristen Welker in Washington. Good day, everyone.
I'm Aaron Gilchrist in New York. You're watching NBC News Now live coverage of the breaking story in Washington, D.C. Two U.S. Capitol Police officers have been injured after someone rammed a barricade outside the U.S. Capitol complex. You're looking at live pictures from several different angles of the scene. What we know at this point is that sometime around 1 o'clock this afternoon, a car was able to make its way to one of the barriers that is always up outside the U.S. Capitol building along Constitution Avenue. That would be the side of the Capitol that runs between the Capitol itself and the Senate office buildings, so the Senate side of the U.S. Capitol. That car hit one of the barricades, and as we understand it from sources that our Justice correspondent Pete Williams has been able to talk to, the person hit that barricade and then jumped out of the car, we believe, with a knife. Two U.S. Capitol police officers engaged with that suspect on some level, as we understand it. Those two officers were injured. The person who was in that car with the knife, as we understand it, was shot. All three of them have been taken to a hospital in the area. D.C. Fire and EMS has been able to verify that information for us. And now we are left with the scenes that you see on your screen at this point. The car slammed up against that barricade. Investigators, obviously, from U.S. Capitol Police. We understand the FBI has been brought in to assist as well. You can see investigators taking photos, walking around this vehicle, gathering information. On the lower part of your screen, on the right side here, you see several black SUVs with flashing lights. The top part there, you see an aerial picture of the Capitol complex that has been locked down, in a sense. We don't believe that it was heavily occupied at this point because Congress is not in session. Still, the campus has been locked down as a result of the threat that we see has happened outside. Now, we have Monica Alba, one of our White House reporters, who's been watching this scene with us as well, trying to gather information. Monica, what's the latest you can tell us about what's unfolding in Washington?
Aaron, it seems per law enforcement officials and also those on the scene that at least this immediate security threat has been contained, given that everybody involved, it seems at this point, has been transported to the hospital. What is so notable there is that new reporting from our colleagues Tom Winner and Pete Williams that the person who did ram this barrier and who got through that initial perimeter fencing then got out of the vehicle brandishing a knife, and that is what led the U.S. Capitol Police to shoot that person. But we also know, of course, that some of those officers were injured when the vehicle hit them. And that barrier, just so people can understand sort of where it is situated, is at least 2 roadblocks removed from getting very close to the U.S. Capitol. But this fencing that's in place right now, anybody who enters the complex has to show ID proving that they work there, have business at the Capitol. It's a heavily controlled system for who can come and go. So clearly this person rammed that barrier regardless of whatever checks were going on, and we are waiting to get more information about that. But this is also notable because just in the last few weeks or so, Aaron, a larger perimeter fence was removed. There was so much non-scalable fencing around all the U.S. Capitol complex with barbed wire on top. That actually got taken down because a couple of months removed from the January 6th violence, lawmakers and people had really called for that to be scaled down, for there to be less of a National Guard presence protecting the Capitol. But this inner fence was always going to remain in place given the heightened alert and security posture that we expect to remain for the coming weeks, at least until President Biden gives his joint address to Congress, which is something else that law enforcement has been monitoring as a potential high alert day, as you would with any presidential movement, but certainly one where this president would go to the U.S. Capitol, which we haven't seen for that kind of an event. So at least that's the posture for now. I just mentioned the president. He's actually not at the White House and wasn't while this was taking place. He landed at Camp David shortly before 1 p.m. He left the White House in the noon hour on Marine One, so via helicopter for the Easter weekend. And we don't have any official White House reaction yet either on whether he's been briefed. You can imagine that he is. He's always traveling with a group of aides who bring him up to speed on any national security issues. But we don't have a statement yet from the president or the White House officially reacting to this security incident. I can tell you here from where I'm standing, Aaron, just above the White House, there's always a lot of security here, again, given the last few months. But really, since the coronavirus pandemic, since some of the protests over racial justice that we've seen over the last few months here in the nation's capital, you have a huge fence around the White House as well. That has stayed in place, and they haven't removed that. But the fencing even that protects the White House itself, 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, is something that's been increased because you did have a situation where a car rammed a barrier some years ago. So this is now, of course, happening closer to the Capitol, where Congress, we should mention, is not in session. So lawmakers aren't there, but there are journalists inside because we continue to constantly report on what's happening on Capitol Hill, given all of the major news that's breaking around other legislative priorities. And we know that our colleagues down there on the other end of Pennsylvania Avenue remain sheltered in place, given this heightened posture, as we wait more information from officials who hopefully will brief in the next hour or so to provide even more background on what occurred here, Aaron.
All right, Monica Alba for us near the White House right now. Monica, I'm going to ask you to stand by, and we'll come back to you as you're able to gather more information. We also have with us Alana Treen. She's a Capitol Hill White House correspondent for Axios. Alana, you there?
I'm here, yes.
Let me ask you, I saw one of our live pictures here, just again, we just saw, it looks like a soldier, maybe some National Guard folks. We know they were close by, who appear to be in riot gear from what I could see, with the shield and the helmet with the mask pulled down in front of it. What are you seeing from your vantage point? There were reports about helicopters in the area as well. What can you tell us?
Well, Aaron, I am not in the Capitol right now, as you can probably see, but I was there this morning. And I think just one thing to note is, and Monica did a great job describing this, but the lessened security presence just in the past several weeks. I was at the Capitol on January 6th during the insurrection, and then have essentially been there every day since. And really, we saw this extremely heightened security presence with these, with the fences and with a large number of National Guardsmen. That has been reduced significantly in the past several weeks as we've gotten farther away from January 6th. And I thought that this morning when I was walking in to the building, how much, how much less fencing there is, how fewer guardsmen that were present. Of course, I left around 11:30, about an hour and a half later is when we've initially heard of the car ramming into that barricade. And from my sources who are on the ground and other colleagues who were or are there right now, it seems that they are still in lockdown, waiting to hear more. But the scene does seem contained now that they have an officer had shot the person who was driving, as well as the other two officers who have seemed to be injured were taken to the hospital. I think it's worth noting that there was a helicopter that came. I haven't really heard of anything like that in my time covering Congress. A helicopter flew down to remove those who were injured, as well as the suspect. And we still don't know what the motive is. I think we're waiting to hear what motivated this person, who they were, why they drove into the barricade this afternoon. And so I think we're all waiting to hear more from U.S. Capitol Police. And they're starting to kind of give out more information now to reporters like myself, and we're standing by to hear what new developments there might be.
All right, Alana, I'll ask you to stick with us, give you an opportunity to check for more information that may be coming your way as we look at some of the live pictures coming from Capitol Hill right now. I believe this is a helicopter shot from our affiliate there in Washington, WRC. Obviously, Washington is a no-fly zone, so the helicopter is far outside the district itself. Zooming into the Capitol complex, showing us several of the buildings that are that are a part of that complex, buildings that would be under that lockdown, along with the Capitol itself. Alana mentioned the helicopter possibly having come in. That likely would have been a U.S. Park Police helicopter. They have a launch pad. U.S. Park Police have a launch pad just a couple of miles away from the Capitol building itself, across the Anacostia River. I lived in Washington for many years, and in the Navy Yard area, which is just a couple of blocks away from the Capitol complex. And so that helicopter I've seen it. I've been to that to their launch pad. They would have been able to dispatch a chopper very quickly. When there was a shooting at the Navy Yard several years ago, that helicopter was used to airlift people who had been injured or people who had been hiding at the Navy Yard to safety. And so they would be able to come into the Capitol complex very quickly. And as Alana noted, possibly lift an injured person away and take them to a medical facility for treatment, although we did also see DC Fire and EMS respond there as well. Monica Alba has been watching this story develop with me. Monica, what more can you tell us?
Well, we're getting our first reaction, Aaron, from congressional leadership. We have a tweet from Minority Leader Mitch McConnell, who says, praying for the United States Capitol police officers who were attacked at the Capitol. We are still learning what's taken place. Grateful to all the U.S. CP and first responders who are on the scene. So that's the real first official reaction we're hearing from, again, leadership on Capitol Hill, who we should point out aren't actually physically there because they're back in their residences and in their hometowns and districts, given, again, that Congress is not in session. So that's the first we're hearing. We're waiting to get more. Nothing official yet from the White House or from Speaker Nancy Pelosi's office, for instance. But another little bit of color that I can provide for you here through our colleague Julie Sirkin, who is on the ground. She covers Capitol Hill, and she is really noting a high presence of more National Guard troops who have now marched to that area, and they're carrying shields. So they are also still in a posture where some of them are even telling her this is still a very active and fluid situation, and they were told essentially to march over there in high numbers. She says she sees dozens and dozens who are there just in case. There are also more ambulances and police cars, and they're being extremely strict, as you can imagine, with who can come and go at this moment, given everything is in lockdown. Something else that our other reporters who cover the Justice Department are confirming to us now, the FBI is involved in the response. You might even see them in some of these images with their notable windbreakers that say it in bright yellow letters. They are on the scene already, also responding to what just happened in the last hour or so here, Aaron.
Monica, I know you've been monitoring what's been coming out of the White House about this, and Jen Psaki, this happened right as she was wrapping up her press briefing today, so there wasn't a lot of information from there. The president, though, even though he was traveling, we know he travels with staff. There likely would have been someone receiving information about what happened at the Capitol, right? I mean, the president would, at this point, even at Camp David, would have to know something is going on.
Absolutely. And I can tell you actually exactly who the president and first lady are traveling with. That's typically something the White House would release anyway on any given movement. They let us know which group of personal aides and other support staff are accompanying him. And on something like this, even though it's a holiday weekend, he's the president of the United States. He's always going to have aides around him who can bring him up to speed on national security issues domestically and internationally. So today he is accompanied by Bruce Reed, who's the Deputy Chief of Staff, Johannes Abraham, who is associated with the National Security Council, Anthony Bernal, who's an advisor to the president and the First Lady, and then Stephen Gopfert, who is also a personal aide. So those are just the people who basically would be with him on Marine One. And then once he has arrived at Camp David, which he did in the last hour or so, they are never far away in case anything like this happens. And they're the ones who are going to be coordinating the information flow to the president, and then, of course, making decisions about whether the president would need to speak to the nation, issue a statement. All of that is being evaluated right now. And yes, Jen Psaki was mid-briefing, even though the president had already left the building for the Easter weekend. She was still answering reporter questions while this was all unfolding. And our own Kelly O'Donnell posed to her whether she knew about this incident or if there were any updates she could provide. She said she would check and get back to us, given, again, she was basically briefing as this was still developing. But she was also quick to point out that, again, with any issue, the president is always accompanied by people for this very same reason, so that then they can brief him and then they can make decisions about what would happen next. I think it is notable, like with any of these very fast-moving law enforcement situations, Aaron, they're taking their time, at least from this perspective, to try to gather more information, learn more before before issuing any kind of statement. But I think also the fact that this overarching reaction from the Minority Leader, Mitch McConnell, seems to be the Capitol Police, it's clear, were attacked. They felt attacked. Their own officers were injured, we have been able to confirm. And if you really think about everything that this force has gone through over the last nearly 3 months, that is very significant and can't be ignored here, given the backdrop of the January 6th attacks. But we also know from Capitol Hill, there's a lot of debate now, Aaron, about whether they're going to study this or do a similar 9/11 style commission report into the security failures. And again, we know that they felt confident enough to remove the very outer perimeter fencing and go back to just the inner perimeter fencing, that clearly they must have felt there wasn't as much of a risk or security threat given the comparison to what we saw in the weeks following the insurrection at the Capitol. But as you can see, again, from this vehicle, those barriers did their job. They are always going to be up and only removed once Capitol Police have said a car can enter the premises. And again, this one was actually 2 full barriers away. But that fencing that you see there is what is likely to remain in place for a long time to come, given January 6th and what we are seeing here today, Aaron.
All right, Monica, hang with us here. I want to stop down for a bit here and just sort of reset a little bit for you. First, the picture, the larger picture you're seeing on your screen here is just outside the fencing, the barricading that was put up around the beginning of this year in the January 6th riots that we saw there. A large law enforcement presence here. It looks like there's some leadership from U.S. Capitol Police, at least. And so we expect that we could be getting a statement, some sort of a briefing from leadership there with Capitol Police at any moment now. We're going to try to make sure we can bring that to you if it happens. At this point, the only official statement that we've seen from U.S. Capitol Police is the tweet that they put out a little less than an hour ago, saying that they were responding to the North Barricade vehicle access point on Constitution Avenue for reports of someone having rammed a vehicle into 2 Capitol Police officers. They said then in that statement that a suspect was in custody, that the officers had been injured, and that all 3 of them, the 2 officers and the suspect, had been taken to the hospital. So that was the official statement, the only official statement we've gotten from U.S. Capitol Police as the story has been unfolding. Monica Alba, again, watching this with me and trying to gather more information as we go. Monica?
Aaron, we're learning more from our colleagues Tom Winter and Jonathan Dienst, who, of course, covers New York City, and they are reporting that the suspect in the U.S. Capitol attack that we've seen here is dead after being shot by police, citing multiple law enforcement officials who were briefed on the investigation. So, again, that's coming from our own NBC News investigations team, that the suspect does appear to be dead. So that is a headline here that, of course, we could be getting more details on, as you mentioned, once we hear an actual briefing from officials. But we're also learning more from senior law enforcement officials who tell my colleagues that it does appear one of the officers was slashed in the face by this knife-wielding suspect. We know that after this person rammed through the barrier, got to that giant white portion and barricade that stopped it, that person did get out of the car, brandished a knife. It seems, obviously, according to this reporting citing a law enforcement official, got close enough to attack one of the officers and slash them in the face, according to Jonathan Dienst. And that person, the officer, has been transported to the hospital. And we know there are several who are injured. It wasn't just this one person. So that is the latest. All of this is very fast moving and breaking at this moment, but we are getting just more and more information trickling in here, Aaron. So that's the latest.
All right, Monica, thank you for that. And I can't help but to note that this is, in my memory, the second time that, as we believe someone's died here, the second time that U.S. Capitol Police have been put in a position where they've had to engage with someone who tried to breach the security apparatus that surrounds the U.S. Capitol, and that person has been shot and died. In 2013, there was another incident where a car approached the U.S. Capitol, refused some of the orders to stop, and then slammed into a barricade before the woman who was in that car at the time back in 2013, who was then shot and died as a result of having come into the Capitol complex the way that she did. We also have one of our, I believe, producers on the phone with us. Julie Sirkin has been. Julie, you're inside the Capitol?
Hey, Aaron. No, I'm actually outside of the Capitol right now.
Okay, tell us what you know. You've been reporting out on this quite a bit over the last hour. What do you know?
Yeah, so I'm standing right now about a block from where the incident took place. I actually watched as around 36 National Guard troops march towards me with shields, fully armed. They have all equipment on them right now to kind of guard this barricade, and they closed, of course, all the entrances surrounding where the scene took place. I'm still seeing ambulance, a really heavy presence of police cars a few blocks down. Just to give you a perspective of my location, I am adjacent to the Supreme Court and by the Senate office buildings, because that's where the incident, of course, took place. And as you mentioned earlier, of course, Congress is not in session right now. The senators and House members are not in the buildings. So when this breach happened, there was no one from government inside the building. But right now outside, it's a really chaotic scene. And the National Guard troops, the numbers just dwindled down in the last few weeks. And these barricades that were in front of me are now not here because they decided to lighten up security. And we're almost 3 months out from January 6th when that insurrection happened. But again, this incident happening, our colleagues reported this appears to be a lone wolf, and the suspect was reportedly shot. It's a chaotic scene out here. The press aren't being allowed in. We're sort of standing on the outskirts. I tried to get in at different entrance points. I sort of walked the perimeter, and cops are really much just trying to figure things out and getting everything together. I watched as National Guard troops came out of the various office buildings to take their posts. They're fully armed, and it appears to be a pretty chaotic situation right now as things are unfolding, and they're trying to secure the perimeter here, Aaron.
So, Julie, does it seem to you as though you mentioned the National Guard troops, does it seem as though they were already nearby with their gear, or that they were brought in and I know the D.C. Armory, the National Guard Armory, is only 2 or 3 miles away from the Capitol complex, but were they already in that area and then immediately moved to those posts, or do you think they were brought in?
So that's a good question. Of course, there were some National Guard troops remaining, obviously nowhere near the levels they have been after the attacks, but they did lessen the Guard presence in the last few weeks. And I watched, like I said, them coming out of the office buildings. So I'm coming out of the office buildings, actually going to the scenes, and I cover Congress, so I see the troops here every single day. They're not nearly as present as they were, but I think that these troops that are here right now, if not all of them, some of them at least came out of the office buildings that are nearby, because of course they kept some level of troops here. But again, this is nowhere near the level it's been. I mean, even now, I'm looking at this barricade, and it seems like they brought out all the troops they had to kind of support the Capitol complex and the Capitol Police right now. And there's about 3.5 of them here. And I watched them march from the scene where the ambulances and police cars still are right now.
And Julie, what's their posture? We saw in some of our live pictures that they were wearing their what looked like riot gear. They had shields, they had helmets that were with masks pulled down. Have they taken on a defensive posture as though they're blocking something, maybe anticipating something, or are they just sort of there just in case?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to say, right? Because their job is to always protect whatever assignment they're deployed to, but they are in full riot gear. They have face shields, they have regular shields, they have their weapons in tow, multiple guns, even the officers here. And they're kind of standing in front of the barricade in one line. Some officers on the outskirts appear, not as tense, not as kind of ready to spring into action. But the ones that are blocking the fences here, this is usually on a typical day where traffic can pass through. They're standing in the entrance in the far right sort of the Senate side of the Capitol complex. Those of you who aren't familiar with it, it takes up a pretty large amount of space. And like I said, the Supreme Court is right to the left of them. So where this incident took place is in a saturated area on a typical day when the Senate is in session. And even when I walked around on the House side of the Capitol, which is, of course, on the opposite side of where this attack took place, the cops there told me, you can go in this side. And they said, never mind, no, you can't. And I was sort of walking in circles, just, showing them my congressional press badge. And then eventually they said, you're not allowed to enter anywhere near here. So in the last 20 minutes or so, when the National Guard troops marched up to the barricades here, this is still unfolding. Like I said, the troop level definitely decreased in the last few weeks, but there are still troops inside the Capitol complex. And it's important to remember that just a few weeks ago, the fencing here would have still been up. And now, of course, it's completely bare.
And Julie, last thing I'll ask you about the reports about helicopters having landed or at least come to the Capitol complex. Were you able to see or hear any helicopters in the time that you've been there?
Yes. So actually, even now, just a few moments ago, I heard and I saw helicopters swirling around really, in the last hour or so, trying to take a better look at the scene as this was all unfolding. One officer, even just a half an hour ago, I asked him if it was still an active shooter situation before we knew that the suspect was apprehended, and he told me he honestly doesn't know. It could be. And so they're really on guard here and on high alert after what happened in the city just 3 months ago next week. And so this is very much still unfolding. They are still very on alert in their security posture. And we just learned actually in 20 minutes that Capitol Police are planning to give a press conference, which is notable because this is their first press conference since the attack happened on January 6th as well.
Absolutely. Julie, I'll give you a moment to look around a little bit more and see what else you may be able to report for us. We'll come back to you. Alana Treen, a reporter with Axios, is also joining us right now. Alana, you've been working some of your sources as well. Have you been able to gather more information?
I have, yes. I think the thing that is raising a lot of eyebrows now is that U.S. Capitol Police, as Julie said, is going to be holding a briefing now around 2:45 p.m. is what they're aiming for. And this is a big deal. One of the biggest criticisms of U.S. Capitol Police and the fallout of the January 6th attack was that they weren't transparent. They weren't good at communicating what was happening on the ground in real time. They didn't hold a briefing. And it's something we've seen now in these hearings since the January 6th insurrection. That they've been criticized for. And so looks like they're starting to learn some of their mistakes and writing it now, this time following today's attack. We're still trying to hear more. I know that there's been some reporting about the condition of the driver. I've heard from some of my sources and some of my security sources on the Hill that he does seem that when he was shot, he's now dead. I think we're still waiting for confirmation from U.S. Capitol Police on that. But that is something that more and more some of my sources and other networks I see are reporting. I think we'll hear more about that at the 2:45 briefing. And I would just note that this is, this is something that is not common at the Capitol, but we've seen this, some really scary events happen in the last few months. Following January 6th, and it's been a lot on U.S. Capitol Police and these National Guardsmen. And I think it'll be interesting, some questions I'm already hearing from different aides and top aides to different lawmakers is whether some of the fencing that was taken down in recent weeks will be put back up, whether President Biden will continue to move forward with his plans to hold a joint address in front of Congress. That's supposed to be coming in the next several weeks, closer to the 100-day mark, which is rapidly approaching on April 30th. No word yet whether this changes those plans. And also, what kind of security will remain now, given what's happened. I think a lot of people who are on the Hill, like Julie, who was just on the program, are still on lockdown. People are not being able to enter or leave the complex. I imagine that will continue for the next potentially few hours. Hopefully people are able to move around shortly. But again, it does seem contained, and we should be hearing from U.S. Capitol Police soon.
All right, Alana Treen from Axios for us. Alana, thank you very much. And we'll note, too, as we approach 2:30 here on the East Coast, that we do anticipate a news conference from U.S. Capitol Police around 2:45 this afternoon, 2:45 Eastern time. We'll, of course, be monitoring for that, and we'll bring it to you as it happens. Tom Winter, our correspondent for investigations, has been gathering information about what's happened here at the Capitol. Tom, you there?
Yes, I've got you, Aaron. So a couple of things that we're working on and we're learning about at this point. That vehicle that's crashed up against the barricade, the initial indications that we had heard or were suspected, I should say, is that the Capitol Police officers that were injured as a result of this incident were injured because they were ran by the car. That appears that it may not be the case. In fact, the suspect, who we now understand, multiple law enforcement officials telling myself and my colleagues, Jonathan Dienst and Pete Williams, that the suspect is deceased after being shot by police. But apparently, when that suspect exited that blue vehicle, tried to or may in fact have stabbed the Capitol Police officers, or at least one of them. And that's what may have led to their serious injuries. And then, of course, the suspect was shot by police and has now, we are told, died as a result of those injuries. Now, we don't know yet where this vehicle came from. We don't know information about the suspect that we're feeling comfortable to share at this point. We want to be very clear about that and make sure that we have that information confirmed when we do report it. So the initial indication and information from the scene is that this was some sort of a criminal incident or attack, that this person tried to get through that barricade, crashed into it, exited the vehicle with a knife, and may have in fact stabbed one or more Capitol Police officers before being shot themselves. We're told the person is a male. Not going to share any other information just yet as we try to confirm that, but that male suspect was shot, taken to the hospital, and has now died as a result of those injuries. As far as a motive, as you might imagine, it is far too soon to know that at this point. The suspect would know what their motives were or are, and that suspect is now dead. So that's going to make things a little bit more complicated. You can be assured in this day and age with license plate readers and the information that law enforcement has at its fingertips that who owns that car and any sort of registration information, that would be known to them already. But as we've seen in other incidents, that doesn't necessarily mean that person is the person who was involved in the incident. The vehicle could be stolen. It could be a rental car. So we are just being extra cautious on that information as law enforcement is being extra cautious to make sure they know who they're dealing with here. And that's the latest on this investigation so far. And obviously, we'll continue to get you some more information as we get it.
Tom, in some of our earlier coverage, Pete Williams indicated that one of the officers who was injured may be in critical condition. What update do you have about the injuries that the officers in this incident sustained?
Yeah, Pete's a little bit more dialed in because of being in Washington, D.C., and because he's Pete, to that specific part of it. So, yes, it does sound like one of those officers is in critical condition. Obviously, a number of police officers injured, one dying as a result of the Capitol attack on January 6th. So this has been a particularly troubling time and trying time for the United States Capitol Police Department.
Tom, you sort of referenced the fact that the law enforcement on the scene here likely already know who the person who was in that car is and have started to check into the vehicle itself. Would that sort of indicate that there are tentacles, the FBI, for example, that are now sort of reaching out into wherever to figure out who this person was, what their motive was, who they know, and trying to get some answers outside of the scene that we're seeing in these live pictures?
That's exactly correct. So what would happen typically in an investigation like this, and I'm not saying specific to this case, but typically what happens based on the people that do this type of work that I've spoken with in the past, they would immediately look at the registration of the vehicle. Once they took the suspect or in the process of taking the suspect to the hospital, they would go into their wallet to try to find some sort of an identification, see if that matches the person in the vehicle. But even then, somebody could come up with a fake identification, could have stolen the vehicle, could be a rental car. And so that information would be a little bit more difficult to get, or you would at least want to confirm it. From there, they would look for a criminal history in their database. Is there anything that they know about that person? Do they have fingerprints already on file? Any sort of criminal information through the FBI's CGIS database? And then from there, you would begin to work backwards and say, okay, if they know who the person is, do they have a social media profile? Did they leave anything behind in the car? Is there anything there that could immediately tell us if there's anybody else who could possibly be involved? Another piece of information that they may want to get is obviously any sort of motive that would be indicated either through those social media posts or through something left behind in the vehicle. Try to speak with those officers as they are trying to be treated, obviously, and see if those officers can say anything about any statements that the suspect gave, if they gave any, in the course of exiting that vehicle. Was there anything that they've shouted or said? We've seen that in other incidents and attacks in the past, and that's been incredibly helpful. So those are things that that's all kind of the initial work that needs to be done here. And you want to, of course, make sure that you're not going to have somebody else involved in a similar type attack that this person may have been working with, though I suspect we would have seen that already.
All right, Tom Winter, bringing us up to speed on how this investigation is likely to be folding out in the first few minutes here. Monica Alba is also with us. She's in Washington, has been watching this unfold and gathering information. Monica, there still appears to be a very large law enforcement presence. We saw some men in uniform, in military uniforms there as well, likely from the D.C. National Guard. What more can you tell us about what's unfolding at the scene here right now?
Huge law enforcement presence, Aaron. That's right. And I expect that will continue. We're getting a little bit more information about the role that the D.C. National Guard is playing here. We know, of course, that guardsmen from all across the country were brought in the weeks after the January 6th attack to protect the Capitol. And remember, it wasn't uncommon to see hundreds of them loading buses and to be coming in and out for their shifts. Remember, in those early days, even sleeping on the floor of Capitol Hill in the hallways before cots were brought in and they could make for more accommodations in nearby hotels. So we know with that context that the National Guard, represented from all over, has been brought in. But the D.C. National Guard specifically today, according to a tweet, deployed an immediate response force, which was composed of National Guard soldiers and airmen to the Capitol complex to support the U.S. Capitol Police. And they couldn't get into more details, they said, given, again, this immediate response force. But it was something that was done so quickly. And that's what I think is really notable here as well. When we look at the time frame, the fact that officials are set to brief in just 10 minutes or so, that is really, really notable, given the fact that after the events of January 6th, we didn't even get an immediate briefing from the U.S. Capitol Police. It took so long to get more information from them and from law enforcement. So a very different approach today because, of course, also it's a very different scale. And that's important to point out here as well. The fact that this is one vehicle ramming through a barrier, but that did injure U.S. Capitol officers. And there's a lot that we don't know, again, regarding motive. But now that we're starting to get more details about the suspect who was taken into custody, and we can report and confirm, according to law enforcement officials now, who's dead, we're going to get even more information. But look at what's on your screen right now. It's just dozens and dozens of law enforcement officials on the ground, and then a huge variety of vehicles, of ambulances and police cars. And then outside of that, you see sort of a ring of dozens and dozens of these National Guardsmen who also were deployed with shields. So they're in a little bit more of an active posture than what you would see in the last few weeks. I live in a neighborhood very close to there, and you really have now become very accustomed to interacting with these National Guardsmen who have been deployed. But really, they're usually just more casually behind the fence, monitoring, making sure everything's okay. So we're seeing a very, very heightened and different security element to this now, given what we just saw over the last couple of hours. But the fact that we're about to get a lot more details speaks to the urgency and some of the new leadership, perhaps, that was installed here for the U.S. Capitol Police and other agencies, because of what experts say was such a failure in terms of what we saw in the initial response on January 6th. So all of that is playing a new role in this narrative of getting us information more quickly. We saw those tweets really come very rapidly just in the hour or so after the event. And now we're also getting a lot more reaction from lawmakers, Aaron, who, again, we should remind viewers, are not physically present at the Capitol because Congress isn't in session right now. They're due to come back on Monday. But we are hearing from people like the minority leader and other House leadership who are really putting the focus right now on the Capitol Police officers, extending prayers for them, thinking of them and their families, given that we know at least a couple of them are injured. So I think we can expect to get more on their situations and how they're doing right now, especially those who were transported to the hospital, from officials here. And again, the one thing we're also really waiting on that is a little bit unusual given how much time has passed, we don't have any White House reaction at this point. We know that the White House press secretary is in the building behind me. She is still here at work monitoring the situation, even though the president is at Camp David, surrounded by a much smaller group of aides who are ostensibly bringing him up to speed on this. But what's also a little bit unusual and unique to the Camp David presidential retreat, Aaron, is that this is a place where the president travels to, but press do not accompany him, which is one of the only places where that's the case. When the president goes to Delaware for the weekend, for instance, or he would take Marine One or Air Force One, there's always a group of journalists who would travel with him. But Camp David is actually an exception, given it's outfitted to really be another executive residence and retreat, and he has all of the security and infrastructure there in place. It's about a 40-minute chopper ride away. So he left in the noon hour. He arrived before 1 p.m., but we haven't heard from him. We haven't gotten any kind of a statement from the White House either, but you can expect that he's been briefed, and when we do have that, we will bring it to you.
All right, Monica Alba for us near the White House right now in Washington. Monica, thank you for that. We'll reiterate that we do anticipate a briefing from U.S. Capitol Police in the next few minutes here. I want to bring in Jim Kavanaugh, who is an MSNBC, NBC News contributor, retired ATF special agent in charge, former hostage negotiator. Jim, you and I have had a few conversations in instances like this where we've watched scenes of this nature unfold. I want to just get your expert perspective on what's happening in Washington right now.
Well, it looks like a one-person attack with a vehicle against the police officers. You know, they would be at the gate that you saw just when you pan back from that steel barricade that's implanted in cement. That's a hydraulic barricade. When that thing goes up, you know, nobody's going to bust through that. But there's a gate in front of that, maybe 40 feet or so, and that's where the officers would normally be. They would not be standing by that metal barricade. So, you know, if the car hit the officers, then continued past them, crashed into that barricade, of course, airbags went off, trunk flew open, front is smashed, and then the assailant exits the vehicle. Pete Williams reported that the Capitol police officer was slashed in the face with a knife, and the assailant was shot, and now he's deceased. So that sounds like what's transpired. You know, an attack with a knife and a car first, then a knife against the uniformed police officers looks like what we have. You know, is it in his mind an attack on the citadel of democracy, or is it an attack on the uniformed police, or is it just a suicide by cop? We don't quite know yet.
Jim, I want to point out for folks again, just as we are approaching 2:45 now, that we are anticipating a news conference. I believe we have some pictures from where this is going to be happening. We can tell you that we expect we're going to hear from the Capitol Police Chief. As a matter of fact, it looks like a delegation of folks working their way. You look at toward the top of your screen there on the left. Those are the sorts of uniforms that you anticipate leadership wearing. And so I would expect that we're going to hear from the U.S. Capitol Police Chief, Chief Pittman, the acting police chief there at the Capitol, when we do get some more information about what unfolded here at the U.S. Capitol, along with some people from the FBI, other folks who've been brought in. Jim Kavanaugh, this is a sort of incident where many of the dozens of law enforcement agencies that are in Washington, D.C. would come together to get control of a scene and then begin investigating, trying to come up with some answers about what happened here, right? All right. It seems we may have... Jim, you there? Go ahead, Jim.
Yeah, I'm here. Yeah. I said the United States Capitol Police has their own detective bureau, and you see those detectives are walking around the car already. And so, you know, they start the investigation. They'll be assisted by the other agencies, of course. But, I mean, it's their ticket, as we say. They're the first ones. It's their man or woman that was assaulted, and they're going to start the investigation right there. Now, the other agencies are going to help them make sure there's no Capitol Police has their own bomb squad, and they're very good. So they're going to make sure that the car is, not have a bomb in it. And here comes the chief.
Jim, how much more difficult is it in an instance like this where the suspect is dead and you as a law enforcement agency, there's no person to interrogate. You have to figure out other ways. Actually, Jim, an NBC News special report beginning right now.
This is an NBC News special report. Here's Kristen Welker.
Good day, everyone. Capitol Police are briefing on that fatal security incident outside the U.S. Capitol this afternoon when a suspect rammed a car into a barrier and then wielded a knife at Capitol police officers. At least 2 injured, and the driver was killed. Let's listen.
The suspect exited the vehicle with a knife in hand. Our officers then engaged that suspect. He did not respond to verbal commands. The suspect did start lunging toward U.S. Capitol Police officers, at which time U.S. Capitol Police officers fired upon the suspect. At this time, the suspect has been pronounced deceased. 2 U.S. Capitol Police officers were transported to 2 different hospitals, and it is with a very, very heavy heart that I announce one of our officers has succumbed to his injuries. We are not able to release any information, names, age, date of birth, or anything of that nature at this time because we still have to notify the next of kin. I just ask that the public continue to keep U.S. Capitol Police and their families in your prayers. This has been an extremely difficult time for U.S. Capitol Police after the events of January 6th and now the events that have occurred here today. So I ask that you keep our U.S. Capitol Police family in your thoughts and prayers. At this time, I'm going to turn it over to the Metropolitan Police Chief, Mr. Robert Conte, for the Metropolitan Police Department's portion of this investigation. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm Robert Conte, Acting Chief of the Metropolitan Police Department. Our members responded to the U.S. Capitol today just after 1:00 p.m. To investigate an officer-involved shooting. At this time, the Metropolitan Police Department's Homicide Division, as well as our Internal Affairs Division, will now take over the investigation with respect to the shooting death that occurred, as well as the officer's death. There's not a lot of information that we can release to the public at this time, but we certainly will be working very closely with our partners at the Park Police, at the U.S. Capitol Police. At this time, I just want to extend my deepest condolences on behalf of the entire Metropolitan Police Department to all of the officers at the United States Capitol Police for their service and unfortunately for the loss of life that have occurred here today at the United States Capitol Police.
Is there an ongoing threat here on Capitol Hill or in the neighborhood? What can you tell residents that live here as well as folks that work in this area?
At this time, it does not appear to be an ongoing threat. Obviously, we're in the very early stages of our investigation. We need to obviously understand the motivation behind this senseless act. So the Metropolitan Police Department will certainly be doing that.
I know you said the suspect is dead, sir. Any reason to know that he was known to Capitol Police or MPD beforehand? Any indication that he was somebody that had been around the Capitol before, maybe spotted, anything like that?
It does not appear that he is known to the Capitol Police or the Metropolitan Police Department at this time.
Is this a terrorism-related?
Sir?
Is this a terrorism-related incident?
It does not appear to be terrorism-related, but obviously we'll continue to investigate to see if there's some type of nexus along those lines.
Will the National Guard's posture change at all? What's their mission look like the next couple of days?
I'll refer that to the United States Capitol Police.
Chief, did the suspect say anything or yell anything at the time?
I would say that at this time, the investigation is still in its preliminary stages, so we don't have that information. And the Capitol Police, as far as its security posture, remains in a steady state at this time. We are very thankful for our National Guard partnership. We do have National Guard on the campus, but the security posture at this time remains the same.
Chief, you said that obviously the vote, you're still looking at the motive, I understand that. Any reason to believe that there was any specific target of member of Congress? Was there a specific member of Congress that the suspect may have been trying to go after? Any indication who that may have been, if that was the case?
We do not have the suspect on file with U.S. Capitol Police, so there's no indication at this time that there's any nexus to any member of Congress.
Can you speak also to the
Yes, ma'am.
Drugs or alcohol involved? Do you believe you found any of that in the car?
We cannot confirm that, but the investigation is ongoing.
Any weapons in the car?
The suspect did exit the vehicle with a knife in hand, and at that time he started to lunge toward, run aggressively toward U.S. Capitol Police office.
Any weapons?
No, that part of the investigation is still ongoing. The scene is still being processed by Metropolitan Police Department, so we will have additional information at a later time.
Was the suspect transported to the hospital?
Did the suspect ever come in contact? I know you mentioned the lunge, but did the suspect come in contact and wrestle with the police officer there?
The investigation is ongoing. From what we can see from video at this time, I do not see the suspect wrestling with a U.S. Capitol Police officer, but when he exited the vehicle, the knife was clearly in his hand, and he did start to run toward the officers.
Can you describe the kind of knife, the type of knife?
So at this time, this is all the questions that I am going to take. I turn it back over to Metropolitan Police Department's chief. Again, I ask you to please keep the United States Capitol Police family in your thoughts and prayers at this time. It has been an extremely difficult and challenging year for us, but we will get through this, and we do appreciate the community's support. Thank you.
Can you give us an update on the second officer's condition?
Hey, folks. We understand that you guys have a lot of questions. Obviously, this is a complex investigation. We are going to be putting out more information as we can on social media, and if we decide to do any more briefings later on, we'll of course let you guys know right away. Thank you.
Chief, can you give us an update on
Chief Conte, can we ask you one more question?
Sure.
One question I have, looking at the grand fabric of all of this, USCP has changed their intelligence, the way they're sharing it. They've been doing what they can to try to beef up the security here, and still they're under attack. What is the answer?
Yeah, well, I think, just part of our responsibilities and duties as law enforcement officers, we're here to protect and serve community. Clearly, this was someone who was actively trying to just get at whoever or whatever. We just don't know right now. So we have a responsibility to investigate that, to get to the bottom of this, whether the attack was at law enforcement or whoever. We have a responsibility to get to the bottom of it, and we'll do that. Thank you.
Die at the scene or at the hospital, sir?
And you have been listening to Capitol Police describe the tragic events as they unfolded just a short time ago outside the U.S. Capitol when a driver rammed into the barrier, lunged at two police officers. Ultimately, one Capitol police officer did succumb to injuries. And so yet again, the Capitol Police has lost one of their own. Of course, on January 6th, Officer Brian Sicknick was attacked when the U.S. Capitol was stormed. He passed away. And so the Capitol Police has been in mourning for quite some time, and now here yet again. This is an investigation that is in its preliminary stages. You just heard the Capitol Police say that it does not appear there is an ongoing threat at this point. They are still working to determine if there are any drugs or alcohol involved in this. It doesn't appear to be terrorism, you heard them say. Let me turn to our Justice correspondent, Pete Williams, who has been tracking the developments of all of this since it first unfolded. Pete, what are your takeaways? What more can you tell us?
Well, first of all, for the police to be able to say they don't think it's terrorism, they must have a pretty good idea of who this was. Now, we're told that they have traced the car, and they know who the car is registered to. What they're trying to determine is that the person who was driving it today? So the last we heard, there was still a little bit of confusion about exactly the identity of the driver. But for the Capitol Police to say there doesn't appear to be a threat at this point is instructive. And the second point, Kristen, is we're not exactly sure what the injuries were that caused the death of the Capitol Police officer, whether it was being struck by the car. The way the police chief described it, it did not sound like the driver with the knife actually managed to get to the police officer and stab the police officer with the knife. But we're just not sure about that, because some of the earlier information we had is that the officer was stabbed, and that the cause of the officer's death might turn out to be more the stab wounds than being struck by the car. But that's one question that the news conference left unresolved. But obviously the big question is, who was behind the wheel? Who is that man with the knife? What was the motive for that? And it's going to be several hours before we know the answer to that. And of course, the normal investigative thing where you question the driver is not going to happen, because he did die in the hospital. And it's been, of course, just shy of 2 hours since this happened. So we're still at the very early stages of this.
And Pete, as we've been discussing, the Capitol already has an increased barrier outside of it because of the events that unfolded on January 6th. When a mob stormed the Capitol and again claimed the life of another U.S. Capitol police officer. What happens now, as you have underscored so well, this investigation is in its early stages?
Well, remember, the security here, quote unquote, worked. That car did not get past that barrier. That's what the security was intended to do. The police officers who were there to make sure it worked, of course, one of them has paid the ultimate price. But whether that means there should be more security, you know, that's something that the members of Congress are going to have to decide.
And Pete, stand by with us as we go to our Capitol Hill correspondent, Casey Hunt, who was there on January 6th when the Capitol was stormed, has been there for so much of the debate about what, if any, security perimeter there should be around the U.S. Capitol. And Casey, as you have reported, this is a community, this is an area that has frankly been on edge to some extent in the wake of January 6th. Now some time has passed, and then this happens. What are your takeaways, Casey?
Kristen, I actually want to focus in on the U.S. Capitol Police specifically because you heard that plea repeated. Pray for the families, pray for the Capitol Police family, and for all of us who are affected by this. I can just tell you this news that another officer has passed away is devastating for the Capitol Hill community. It's devastating for those of us who consider ourselves part of that community, having been there as reporters, in my case, for many years, and there are many others who've been there longer than I have as well. These officers have been working around the clock since January 6th. They don't have enough manpower, so they're putting in overtime hours. They're working weekends. Some of them, I talked to one officer who had gone 20-plus days without a day off in the wake of the insurrection because the security posture was so on high. So to have something like this happen where yet another of their comrades has fallen and where it seems like such a deliberate attack, to have a man get out of a car with a knife and go after an officer, really, I think, just feels like being hit when you're already down. And so I think that I'm already hearing from members of Congress, from staffers who are texting or writing to just say that they're heartbroken. And so I think that there is a lot of anger, a lot of sadness right now about what has happened here. Now, big picture, you're right to point out that there has been a lot of discussion also about the security perimeter. And had they not moved the security perimeter back a little bit toward the Capitol, this car would not have been able to reach this point that it did. Although that's not to say that there couldn't have been a similar incident with a police officer at a different checkpoint. I mean, they have to guard the walls at some place. And in this case, the incident happened closer to the Capitol than it might have. But at the end of the day, the security did work in this incident. Now, the other piece of this is, in the past, there have been incidents that have nothing to do with politics that occur near or around the Capitol that simply because of the nature of the city that we live in here in Washington, you can have a completely random event happen in proximity to power. There was a woman who drove a car near the Capitol and was killed in an incident a few years ago that I covered. It was not related to politics at all. Obviously, because of the climate, because of January 6th, it's a completely different situation now, and there is this very high alert. Now, the other thing I would pick up on as well that we learned in this briefing was that this person was not on the radar of Capitol Police. So Capitol Police have a very specific mission. It is to protect members of Congress. They don't have really any other, even the building, as you saw during the insurrection, is secondary to the members. And so they track every threat that members get. So they're following people who perhaps are showing up at offices in their districts, who are sending threats, who are leaving threatening voicemails. It's really increased in the wake of January 6th. And at the end of the Trump presidency, people started getting many more threats than had been normal in the past. But what they said is that the suspect is not in that database, is not on their radar as someone who has persistently threatened a certain member of Congress or members of Congress. So I thought that was an interesting data point, and I'm sure Pete and others will have more reporting on this as this investigation unfolds. I think the big question for everyone simply is was this a politically motivated attack or was it not, Kristen?
Casey, really important point. Let's head to former FBI Assistant Director for Counterintelligence and NBC National Security contributor Frank Figliuzzi. Frank, pick up on that point that Casey raises. That's going to be the big question now. What are investigators going to be focused on?
This is a full identification and intelligence investigation at this point. Who is this person? Who are they affiliated with, if anyone? What is a criminal history? What is the intelligence history? Do they appear in any FBI or other law enforcement or intelligence database? How did they get here today? Do they own weapons? Is there a history of mental health? Search warrants will be drafted almost as we speak for any residence or place of business that he is associated with. So they will grab devices, computers, phones, etc. They'll exploit anything in his pockets, any devices on him, all in an attempt to see why he did this and who he is.
All right, Frank Figliuzzi, Casey Hunt, Pete Williams, thank you for helping us with this breaking news coverage. One U.S. Capitol Police officer has been killed, another injured after a car crashed into a barrier. We will have full details coming up on NBC Nightly News. I'm Kristen Welker in Washington. Good day, everyone.
Here?
I'm Aaron Gilchrist in New York. You're watching breaking news coverage out of Washington, D.C. on NBC News Now, where we've learned that for the second time this year, a United States Capitol Police officer has been killed in the line of duty. A second person, a suspect in this case, has also died. That information coming from the acting police chief of U.S. Capitol Police during a short briefing that they gave a few minutes ago. We know at this point that the person who was driving the car you see on your screen here hit two Capitol Police officers before being shot by a police officer after wielding a knife, getting out of the car wielding a knife. Monica Alba is in Washington for us. She's been following these developments. Monica, can you lay out first what we know about what happened starting at about 1 o'clock this afternoon?
Yes, Aaron, and really the main headline here is that according to U.S. Capitol Police, the threat is over at this time. This is no longer an active situation. They do believe that that has been contained, and we got that horrifically tragic update that one of the Capitol Police officers who was involved in responding to this attack has died of their injuries. We did not get a lot of information, even though the reporters at that briefing were trying to ask about what kind of injuries and whether the officer died at the scene or at the hospital or on the way. So there is some question marks that linger over that question. But we know that the suspect in this vehicle, who is also dead, according to law enforcement officials, got through the barrier in the vehicle. This man then exited holding a knife, lunged at the officers. And very interesting to note here, Aaron, this is something that the officials said they have video of. Of course, this is a heavily patrolled area with a big police and law enforcement presence, but they also have plenty of security cameras and perhaps other eyewitnesses who have this on video, and that they were able to review that. And they said that the suspect did lunge with a knife, and then the suspect was shot by the responding officers and then ultimately did die from those injuries. So the other really important headlines here that now officials can confirm, they believe and say this is not terrorism related, that this person, this suspect who died, was not on file with the U.S. Capitol Police, and they don't believe any particular member of Congress was targeted with this attack. They were asked whether there's any other information about the motive, and they said that it is just too soon at this time. They weren't going to be able to give more details. But importantly, of course, this investigation is ongoing, and that is what we do know at this point. Now, I can tell you also that President Biden is at Camp David. He is at the presidential retreat in Maryland. I can confirm he has been briefed on the incident by the aides who traveled with him, and the White House is preparing to release a paper statement in the next hour or so. So we will bring that to you when we know it, Aaron. But really here, I just can't emphasize enough on this Good Friday, as we just get over the 3 p.m. mark, even as those police officials were briefing, you could hear church bells toll in the background when they offered that very very somber and awful update, and really everybody just extending their thoughts and prayers to this fallen U.S. Capitol Police officer and their family. There have only been really a handful of Capitol Police officers who have ever died trying to defend it. And of course, we know that Officer Brian Sicknick was someone who did die in the line of duty around the January 6 attacks. We don't yet know the identity. They haven't given us that information for the officer who lost their life today, Aaron.
All right, Monica Alba for us in Washington right now. Monica, thank you for that. It's worth noting that the U.S. Capitol was not occupied in any significant way in terms of large numbers of people who were working in the building because it is a holiday weekend. Congress is not in session. There were not many staffers, if any, in the building, the Capitol or the office buildings that surround it today because of the holiday weekend that we are in. I want to bring in NBC News national security analyst Frank Figluzzi, who's been watching some of this unfold as well. Frank, just your initial impressions about what we've learned so far and what you would be able to tell us about what's happening now. Frank, you there?
Well, first, obviously, we've had it. Yeah, I'm here. Obviously, we've had a tragedy with the fatality of a police officer and the subject being killed as well. But this could have been even worse had it not been contained at the barricade situation. What's happening now is a full-blown investigation and intelligence operation. By that, I mean everything possible that can be learned about the subject, where he came from, how he got there, why he did this, whether or not he's affiliated with any known domestic or international terrorist group, whether he has a history of mental illness or has purchased weapons or has explosive histories. All of that is being worked on now. And even as we speak, it's likely that search warrants are being drafted for his residence or place of business so that his devices can be scrubbed and scoured for any reasons and motivations that can be learned about why he did this and whether there's any continuing threat from others who might be associated with him.
Frank, as I think about the response to an incident like this, we know that the Capitol complex and that area around it is fairly heavily fortified. Obviously, the police presence that's there, the barriers that are both always up and only raised when necessary would be options, things that could be deployed here and used to stop a potential threat. But talk a little bit about how uncommon, how rare, how surprising it is to have an incident like this happen outside the Capitol. And obviously, we can't even begin to compare it to what happened on January 6th, a much different sort of incident versus what we are seeing here today.
Well, I think we're in an era now, while it's not unprecedented, we're now moving into an era where the Capitol building itself, the iconic symbol of our democracy that it is now becoming a target of its own. It used to be individual senators, members of Congress. Somebody might try to breach security occasionally. Individual members would get threats. But now I think we're into a place where the Capitol itself is an iconic threat target of its own. And I have to say, I've said on the NBC network before that any talk about lessening the security post-January 6th was premature. Why? Because we have a security review that's been done by retired General Honore. It has very specific recommendations. It points out that upwards of 800 more personnel might be needed, not only to fill current vacancies at the Capitol Police, but also to create a rapid deployment force that can respond around the Capitol region. That's not been done yet we've seen some lessening of the perimeter at the Capitol. I think that's likely premature. You'll see a renewed call now for speeding up the process of enhancing and responding to the security review recommendations.
All right, Frank, I'll ask you to stand by for a second here. NBC News correspondent Vaughn Hilliard is on Capitol Hill for us right now, I believe. Vaughn, are you there?
Yeah, I am with you.
So set the scene for us, Vaughn. What have you been able to see? Where are you exactly?
Yeah, we're right here on the corner of First and Constitution. I'm going to kind of give you a little sense of where we are. If you swing over here to our right is where actually the U.S. Capitol is, and it's just up this hill. This is Constitution Avenue, where the scene of the incident took place here. So just one block up that way, a Scritch or photog, I'm going to have him zoom in there. You can see down the way the flashing lights there. To the left of those flashing lights is the Russell Senate office building. every single member of the Senate has an office that is off of the actual Capitol complex. And you can see that where that incident took place is actually situated right between those Senate office buildings and the U.S. Capitol. You can see, obviously, behind us here, there's an array of National Guardsmen who have been in Washington, D.C. ever since January 6th, the day of the insurrection. But what you see here is not what you've seen here in the previous weeks. There was an immediate response team that the Pentagon has confirmed that they sent out from the National Guard to assist with the situation out here over these last 2 hours. There's still 2,300 National Guard that have been remaining here in this greater D.C. Capitol complex area here over the course of these last several weeks to help out with the U.S. Capitol Police. But they actually stood exactly on this very intersection back on January 6th, now 3 months ago. And it was only a few days after that when the remains of Capitol Police Officer Brian Sicknick were brought down in a caravan of police vehicles that made their way down these very streets. These streets are, this winter here, have been the quietest of any winter in Washington, D.C. This is not normally what this Capitol complex looks like. And I got to tell you, it was just under 2 weeks ago, actually, 2 weekends ago, when they began taking down that layer of fencing here that restricted folks even up until this point. And there was sort of a spring atmosphere in the air when that first layer of fencing began coming down. But what you can see from the images of the incident there, where that car hit those barriers, is that other layer of fencing. That is not normally there. That fencing went up in the days after January 6th. It was General Russell Honore who was tasked by Speaker Nancy Pelosi to conduct an overview of what security measures needed to be in place so that an event like January 6th wouldn't happen again, or other serious security incidents wouldn't take place. And one of the issues, he said, is that the government needs to take seriously the threat within. Of course, we still know very little about this individual involved in this situation here. But at the same time, when you're looking at the incident here, what you do see is that a barrier stopped that car. And now we have learned that one officer was injured and another officer killed. This is a security presence outside of the U.S. Capitol complex that not only is protecting the members, but also their staffs, the press, those that work in the Capitol. But also, this is a place where the public comes to speak to their members of Congress, where they can go up, literally walk through the doors of their members' offices. And ever since January 6th, that has not been able to take place. And I think what today's event unfortunately showed us, number one, is that the U.S. Capitol Police are playing an ever-important role here around this Capitol perimeter here, but also that those conversations that are taking place not only among U.S. Capitol Police, but other federal law enforcement agencies, and as well as the Senate and the House of Representatives about what type of infrastructure needs to be up here long term, that those conversations remain prevalent today, and that this was not just a matter of January 6th, but this is a matter of understanding what security needs to be in place here in the long haul.
Vaughn, since you're on the ground there, I do want to ask you and get some perspective about the layout around the Capitol right now as we're looking at one picture of the dome and a picture of the car that is still on the scene, the car that rammed the barricade there, a barricade that would have been fairly close to the Capitol building itself. And I'll note for our viewers that the lockdown at the Capitol has been lifted in the last few minutes. Earlier, there were instructions for people who may have been in the complex to not to leave or for no one to try to enter the complex. They were able to move around inside. The lockdown's been lifted now. But Vaughn, you talked about the fencing that was put up post-January 6th and the fact that so much of it has come down. From where you are right now, in comparison to where this car ran into that barrier, was there fencing there toward, I guess you're south of the actual Capitol building, south and west, right?
Up until I'm going to have Scritch walk around here with us to try to see if we can get the best angle that we can, because it was not until Saturday, 2 Saturdays ago, so about 12 days ago, cars were still not allowed to drive even through this intersection, up Constitution Avenue. This entire section over here, I'll have Scritch pan over here, this was all closed off. Up until now, obviously, police have put up a perimeter here yet again after today's incident here. But no, this is generally an open passageway, and it wasn't until 12 days ago that they actually opened this area again to the general public and to cars. And so that very area that you're looking at, cars were not able to drive past the U.S. Supreme Court, past those U.S. Senate and U.S. House offices, and get even that close to the U.S. Capitol. We should know, you see that barrier that the car struck. That barrier is always there. That barrier existed before January 6th, and I think that's important. You only see, whether it be top leadership of Congress or folks from the executive branch or some others that are able to drive down, but those barriers generally are always up. But that layer of fencing that I know you can see right now in Scritch's shot, but also in the video of where the car struck, that fencing that you're seeing there did not go up until after the events of January 6th. We're already having some conversations here as to what this perimeter looks like here, because you saw some members of Congress say take all the fencing down, and others say that, throwing out ideas, whether it be permanent fencing or General Honore, again, that individual who was tasked by Pelosi to look about long-term security changes, he suggested retractable fencing. You see from that barrier that it was up, clearly that layer of barrier was important to keeping that individual from gaining any greater access to the Capitol complex.
All right, Vaughn Hilliard on the ground for us in Washington, outside the U.S. Capitol right now. Vaughn, thank you for that. As we continue to follow this breaking story in Washington, a U.S. Capitol police officer has died as a result of injuries sustained when someone rammed the vehicle that you see on your screen here into two Capitol police officers and then into the barricade that you see just outside the Capitol building itself. You may be able to see in the car that the hood of the car is smashed, likely as a result of hitting the barrier. The windshield of the car is smashed, presumably either from when it impacted the barrier or from when it impacted one of the two police officers who were hit by this car before the driver jumped out and was able to engage with officers before being shot by U.S. Capitol Police. We can tell you that Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi has been made aware of the incident here and has ordered that flags at the U.S. Capitol be lowered to half staff. Obviously, in the live picture you're seeing here, the flags haven't been lowered yet. It will take a few minutes for that to happen, but the order has been sent for that to happen as a result of the officer dying in this incident with someone who tried to access the Capitol building, the Capitol grounds there with that car, and then with a knife. We want to turn to an NBC News senior national security analyst, Juan Zarate, who's been watching some of the coverage, also a former deputy national security advisor under President George W. Bush. Juan, I want to get your thoughts. We're trying to understand some of the conversations that might be happening when an incident like this unfolds. Obviously, we know the president is at Camp David. Congress is not in session, but the security apparatus, the national security conversations don't stop because people aren't in Washington, right?
Absolutely. They continue, and an incident like this sparks a lot of questions and tension and concern around what this incident may represent. Of course, this is seen in the lens of what happened on January 6th, the insurrection. It's also seen in light of September 11th and prior incidents that look a lot like this in the past. And so national security officials, law enforcement are obviously looking at this particular incident, but trying to put it in context as it represents something else that's at play. And certainly from a counterterrorism perspective, an incident like this would be viewed in the context of who the person may be connected to, whether or not this is part of something bigger. But the reality, the sad reality of a tragedy like this is that it underscores the fact that the Capitol is a principal target. It is a symbol of American democracy. As Frank said, more and more, this is becoming a target for individuals, maybe like this person, and groups. And the reality then is that the security profile has to reflect those threats. And that's what we've seen over the last few weeks. It is important to note after 9/11, of course, the Capitol, we presumed, was the fourth target for the fourth airliner. And we knew thereafter that the Capitol was a key symbol and target for terrorist groups and those seeking to disrupt American democracy. So the concern about the Capitol isn't new. It's the intensity of focus and what January 6th did to ramp up a sense of threat. And so the national security establishment, the law enforcement community reacted quickly. You've seen the rapid response from the National Guard. And certainly there's going to be concern about what this represents in context. But fortunately, you see that the lockdown's lifted. We don't see that there's concern about other potential attackers, all of which officials would be worried about in the normal course of an attack or an incident like this.
All right, Juan, thank you. I want to bring in NBC News law enforcement analyst Carmen Best, the retired Seattle police chief. Chief, I want to get your perspective on this. Obviously, we're at a point now where there's an investigation that is happening. The D.C. Police Department, the local police agency there in Washington, has been brought in to be a part of that investigation. What would law enforcement be looking at this point in the on-the-ground investigation? If you're part of the detective team and the forensic team that's on a scene like this?
Sure, absolutely. I just want to start by saying our thoughts and our prayers are with the U.S. Capitol Police and another tragic officer dying in the line of duty. Just have to start by acknowledging and paying remembrances there. In regards to the investigation, there'll be both a local and federal response that we'll talk about. They'll be looking at the evidence presented. Clearly, they're going to try to find as much information as they can about the suspect involved. We know he's deceased, but even with that, we want to make sure that we have as much information as possible about his whereabouts prior to coming to the Capitol, who he may have been associated with, running his name for any criminal history, locating and contacting any friends or family that they can, getting a clear picture of, what was going on in the hours, days, and months prior to this very tragic attack on the Capitol, to try to find some reason or some purpose why this occurred. Additionally, the police department, of course, will be looking at preparing for another officer-involved memorial and trying to come to grips with another tragic incident coming on the heels of an awful insurrection. And then there'll be a lot of focus on the safety around the Capitol. Discussions have already been in place, and they're going to be intensified about what to do to maintain safety in that area, considering these last two really tragic attacks that have happened.
Chief, everyone involved with this investigation now is a member of law enforcement, even if they're not a member of the U.S. Capitol Police. Everyone knows that another officer has died as a result of what happened here on this day. How much does that figure into what's unfolding on the ground right now? I don't know if it makes it more difficult for law enforcement or if it is sort of energizing in the sense that one of their own has been impacted by what happened here today.
But regardless of who the victims were, it's a tragic, tragic scenario. And clearly having one of our own dying in the line of duty like this only intensifies the sadness of all of this. And this is not just felt, this is going to be felt all across the nation as attacks on officers and as these discussions about safety around capitals increases. We don't know, again, the motive of the suspect, whether or not this person was a lone wolf or involved in some sort of coordinated conspiracy. But either way, we know that we have to have an elevated sense of awareness at the potential risk to everyone in the profession and every capital, actually, in many cases. So there'll be those thoughts that are going to be circling sort of in the backs of everybody's minds as they progress forward to collect evidence and bring forward a picture of what happened.
All right. Former Seattle Police Chief Carmen Best, we appreciate your perspective on this as we continue to watch live pictures from Washington, D.C. A formidable scene here as we see what we believe to be National Guard soldiers and airmen being brought into this area. We were told by the National Guard a while ago via a statement they put out that they were bringing in airmen and soldiers to reinforce the Capitol Police resources that were on the ground there around the scene. Obviously, still a very active investigation going on here, and very likely that these troops are being brought in to help secure the scene. The Capitol complex is large. It is sprawling across an area of Washington, D.C., sort of between Independence, right on the end of the National Mall, the far end of the National Mall. And so there's an interest in making sure that no one gets into that area and can tamper with the scene. No one gets out of the area if they need not leave that area while the investigation is ongoing. And so that may explain a bit why we see such a large footprint of National Guard folks being brought into this area just to make sure they can create a perimeter around the area to continue with the gathering of evidence uninterrupted. Again, we focused in on this car, this blue car that you see that is now pressed up against a barrier just a few yards possibly from the Capitol building itself. The explanation that we got from the acting police chief of the Capitol Police Department was that this car approached this area around the U.S. Capitol, hit two Capitol police officers, and then slammed into this barricade that is a barricade that is always up that allows cars to access areas closer to the Capitol building itself after having gone through the checkpoint. The driver of that car then jumped out, as we understand it from the police chief and video that she and others have reviewed, jumped out of the car with a knife and then either ran at or lunged toward some Capitol police officers, as she explained it, before being shot by law enforcement there on the scene. The driver of the car taken to the hospital along with the two police officers who were hit. One police officer, as we understand it, has died, and the driver who was in that car, the suspect in this incident, also has died from his injuries. And so that leaves us now with the scene that you see, the split screen here, where law enforcement are on the scene with heavy hearts, investigating, trying to figure out why this happened. And then there are all the questions that surround a scene like this around how do you prevent something like this from happening again? The Speaker of the House has ordered flags at the Capitol to be lowered to half staff. And we've also heard from the Senate Minority Leader expressing his sadness at the scene that's unfolded here. Other members of Congress saying their hearts go out to the family of the law enforcement officer who died, as well as the law enforcement family itself here at the U.S. Capitol for a second time this year, having to deal with the death of a Capitol police officer. Frank Figliuzzi is with us watching this scene as well. Frank, we are obviously still in the early stages of the investigation of the scene here. Still a lot of questions that are unanswered. Just curious about your thoughts about what, as we go forward, what are some of the sorts of questions that you would anticipate investigators are digging into? And we know the FBI has been brought in to help with the investigation here, and they have the ability to start reaching out far beyond Washington, D.C. to look for answers, right?
That's true. The FBI will play a very significant role in this investigation. At some point, don't be surprised if they become the primary investigative agency, and that would be a clue that there might be some domestic or international terrorist affiliation that's been discovered. But in the interim, you're right. They are scrubbing all databases, checking with not only the U.S. intelligence community, but foreign allied intelligence services to see if there's any record of this individual anywhere in any database. And then you'll see federal search warrants being drafted for his business, his residence, his devices. There'll be literally hundreds of interviews potentially conducted throughout the United States of relatives, co-workers, to gain a full picture his history was. And then, you're going to see renewed calls and questions about security at the Capitol. We have the benefit of a completed security review after January 6th that told us alarmingly that there were a couple of hundred vacancies already in the Capitol Police Force, that an additional 400 to 600 people would be needed to create a QRF, quick reaction force. We need to know whether that's truly been done or not. I fear it has not yet been done. And there is a positive here from a security standpoint, which is that this horrible incident tragic as it is, happened at a perimeter. That barricade worked, those officers worked, and we have something horrible, but it happened outside the Capitol, not inside the Capitol. So that's always the issue with security planning, whether you're attending a Major League Baseball game or you're visiting the Capitol. How far out should your perimeter be? And the message, though, being sent today is twofold to those who would think about threatening the Capitol. One, you will likely not succeed. You may die in the attempt. But two, you can get pretty darn close to the Capitol still, even after the January 6th incident. That whole thing needs to be reviewed.
Frank, what do you make of the fact that this happened on a holiday weekend? The Capitol was almost entirely vacant as this was unfolding. Congress not in session, and Easter is just a couple of days away, and yet someone would still make this sort of an attempt. It sort of boggles the mind. They wouldn't have been trying to get to a member of Congress, it would seem, on a day like this.
Well, we've already heard from the Capitol Police spokesperson that this person's name does not appear in their Capitol Police database. That's a clue that they don't know this person to have ever threatened a sitting member of Congress or senator, or even in the past, a member of the Congress. So that, plus the fact that they're out of session today, tells me that this was not designed to harm members of Congress, but rather it may be the work of a deranged person who simply sees the Capitol as an iconic target or a high-profile target to do something that will make the news. Time will tell as to what the motivation was.
All right, Frank Figliuzzi, thank you, sir. Monica Alba, White House correspondent, still on the ground for us there in Washington. Monica, we've been trying to get a handle on sort of who's been looped into what's happening at the Capitol while the lockdown is over and the scene is now one that is investigative as opposed to responsive to a threat. There are still conversations being had about what happened here, and we're wondering the degree to which the White House and the president have been looped in here now that we're an hour and a half since this happened.
I can tell you, Aaron, that the president has been briefed. He is aware of this incident, and he is surrounded by a small group of aides, including his deputy chief of staff, Bruce Reed, who likely brought him up to speed on this as it was happening. We know the president took off for Camp David in the noon hour. He arrived right before 1 p.m. And so in the last couple of hours, he's been getting the information as it's been coming in. But this is happening at a presidential retreat where there are no reporters. The pool that normally accompanies the president does not travel to Camp David, since it is its own executive retreat, and it's equipped with all the security and infrastructure there. So we know the White House is preparing to release a paper statement. It will likely be in the president's name. We don't know yet what it will say, given that they are still probably monitoring and assessing the situation, perhaps talking to other members and leaders on Capitol Hill and coordinating a response in that way. But we have heard and seen at least some tweets from congressional leadership, and Speaker Nancy Pelosi has already asked for the flags to be lowered. That's not something that has happened yet at the White House. When that does happen, it is usually issued by proclamation, and that has to be put together. And then once that is released and officially ordered by the president, then we'll see the flag here at the White House be lowered as well. That will likely happen later this afternoon and evening. But something else the White House is telling us, they've already called a lid for the day, which means they don't expect anything to take place on camera in terms of movements or statements as it relates to the president. So this is not a situation where they're leaving the door open for the president to come back to the White House and make a statement here. Otherwise, they would have extended that and they wouldn't have called that lid. So we don't know what that might mean for the weekend. But as we expect it now, the president will remain at Camp David, given it is Easter on Sunday, and he is celebrating that as a family over the next couple of days there in Maryland. So the other question, Aaron, is what else we may hear from the president, or when that might happen, and how they may want to get his voice out, whether it's just a paper statement. He could always record a video there as well. That's something that we're waiting to hear. Also from the White House press secretary, who is still here at the White House and working, and we'll see what other details we get and bring them to you as soon as we get them.
Monica, I am a bit curious, though. Is it unusual? It's been, as I said, an hour and a half now, and no word from the White House, the Capitol, right down the street there. Is it unusual to have not heard something at this point in time?
I'm a little bit surprised because sometimes what happens is the president and the White House want to wait for officials to do their own briefing before speaking out. But that did already happen more than 45 minutes ago. We got that briefing where they answered a lot of the main questions as it relates to the suspect and the incident. So now that that has all taken place, I imagine this is something that is imminent. The White House has told us for the last hour or so that they've been working on it. So we do expect that to come in the next little bit. But something else that's hard to know because we can't see what the president is doing or who he's meeting with is there's also a chance and possibility here that he's making a lot of phone calls behind the scenes, that he's trying to talk to people who may have been involved, or he's trying to get in touch with the leadership at Capitol Police also. And so all of those different things sometimes take a lot of time, and the White House isn't giving us any kind of readout of exactly how the president is spending these few hours at Camp David. All we know is that he's been briefed. He has been briefed, and a statement is coming soon. But it is kind of notable and unusual, Aaron, because Camp David is, I think, the only place where the president goes where he's not accompanied by a pool of journalists who at any moment could be scrambled and assembled so that he could either go answer questions on camera or field questions. So the fact that that's not really an option given where he is right now means they will likely default to this paper statement. And the fact that we have a lid means we shouldn't expect to hear from the president on camera, at least today.
Monica, I know that you mentioned it. We've heard some from some members of Congress. Obviously, we've noted that Congress is not in session and they're spread out back at home for the holiday weekend. But what have you heard to this point as far as comments about what happened at the Capitol from any members of Congress? I know statements have been slowly coming in.
Yeah, now we've actually seen probably dozens of lawmakers issue their thoughts and prayers, really, to this U.S. Capitol Police officer who died in the line of duty and to that person's family. In fact, one of the first people who confirmed that the officer had died was Congressman Tim Ryan of Ohio. He tweeted out that he had been briefed on the security incident and mentioned that this officer tragically passed away. That was one of the first official fonts of information that confirmed that had taken place. We're also hearing from people like Minority Leader Mitch McConnell. We're hearing from Kevin McCarthy on the House leadership side, and then Speaker Nancy Pelosi, who, again, we should point out, all of these people were not physically at the Capitol when this happened. And we know also from law enforcement officials who gave that briefing, they don't believe that any specific member of Congress was targeted in this attack. And they said that this suspect who died was not even on file with the U.S. Capitol Police. So this wasn't somebody who was known to them, and there doesn't appear to be any motive, they say, at this time that specifically ties this individual with any of the 500-plus lawmakers on Capitol Hill, who, again, as you point out, Aaron, were not there today, but who will be back when the session convenes again on Monday. And I think you can expect a lot of debate about what happens now in terms of the security presence. If this was a one-off, if it's not connected to the January 6 attacks, which we simply don't know, it's too soon to say, there may be more calls to restrict the perimeter fencing. In fact, some lawmakers have said that they believe this inner fencing should also be removed and it should go back to the way it was before the January 6th attack. Whereas, of course, you have others who are very concerned who say that fencing is critical because it helps stop things like this. And obviously today, what's so important to note here is that the Capitol Police officers did everything they were supposed to do. Those barricades did the job they were supposed to do. And this situation, of course, there's a lot that's still unknown, but what's so horrific is that it was stopped well before that person would ever have been able to even get close to the Capitol. In fact, 2 barriers away from it. But a lot of questions remain about the security posture going forward, Aaron.
All right, Monica Alba for us near the White House. And I'll point out, since it's loud enough for us to hear it, Monica, there's you're near the White House and there's always activity, not necessarily or not at all, I would imagine, connected to what's happening at the Capitol. So, Monica, thank you. I do want to note, as we've now seen a written statement from Capitol Police, just a few details here that we hadn't received earlier. In this case, that one of those officers who was hit by the car, by the blue car you see here, was driven to the hospital in a police cruiser. So indication that that officer at least was hurt badly enough that waiting for an ambulance to arrive on the scene there was not an option that some other officers there thought was prudent. And so the officer was taken by car to the hospital in at least one of the instances here. Leanne Caldwell is our Capitol Hill correspondent who is also joining us now, I believe, at the scene. Leanne, what can you add for us?
Martha, hello again. You're
Hey, Aaron. So that's right. Where I am, I'm just going to set the scene a little bit. So right behind me is Constitution Avenue. You see an ambulance still. The ambulance right behind the ambulance is actually the entrance to the Capitol, and that is where the car turned in, struck two Capitol police officers, and then ran in to that barrier. You could still see. I'm not sure if our camera can see it, but there's still. You could still see the car there. With the hood, with the trunk hood open. And so, you know, we have heard some extremely tragic news today. When U.S. Capitol Police Chief Pittman came to give the press conference, we thought that she was going to give an update. We did not expect that the news was going to be that one of the officers succumbed to his or her injuries. It seems like they were struck, the two officers were struck by the car, and one of the officers has died because of that. It is just an extremely tragic day, once again, for the Capitol Police officers. You know, just backing up, earlier in the day, I was in the Russell Senate office building, which is right next to me. I think that, you know, Rudy, the camera guy, is going to try to get a little bit of it. And that is where a lot of report we do our live shots from the Russell Rotunda. That's where senators have their offices. That's where staff sit in their offices as well. And this entrance to the Capitol where the car crashed into is where members drive through on a daily basis. Staff members walk through on foot on a daily basis. And those barricades, that white car barricade that it crashed into, those were barricades that were put up after one of the last big security threats, not January 6th, of course, but September 11th. So every time there is an increased threat to the Capitol, to Washington, to our seats of government, there is more and more security that is put up. Things like these metal posts here, those were all put up after September 11th as well. And so this is really going to change once again the conversation that was currently underway after January 6th about what security is going to look like. That was a conversation that had become actually quite political in the last several weeks, as there was lots of discussions. People wanted this black fence behind me taken down. The outer perimeter black fence that was put up after January 6th was taken down. So just in the past couple weeks were cars allowed to drive on Constitution Avenue for the first time since January 6th, and that is why that driver was able to pull very close into the Capitol and strike two police officers. Speaker Pelosi is starting to ready a $2 billion supplemental security package to try to come up with some sort of security plan moving forward. That is a debate that has been underway after January 6th, and this is most likely going to once again change that conversation, because as the Capitol, which has been known as the People's House, as many tourists, many people usually, in pre-COVID times anyway, would walk these halls, come into the Capitol, have tours. It was a very open place where reporters, lawmakers, aides, and tourists all meshed in the same rooms, in the same hallways, in this very, very, gorgeous building behind me. But once again, we lost there's the loss of the Capitol Police officer today was another horrible day after they have been through so much in the past couple months, Aaron.
Yeah. Leanne Caldwell for us outside the U.S. Capitol. Leanne, I'm going to ask you to stand by for us for a second. I have more questions for you, but we do need to pause here for a moment as we are covering this story. The lockdown lifted at the U.S. Capitol after an incident in which a Capitol police officer was killed. A suspect was killed as well. Our coverage continues after a short break.
She planned for the end of the world. Death followed in her wake, and her children went missing. Mommy Doomsday, the Dateline podcast.
It has to be heard to be believed.
Listen to all episodes now.
Get more of everything you love about today, now all day.
Woo!
Talk with friends all day.
Oh, man.
Feel good stories.
Kiss the bride.
All day. Chef secrets all day.
Salute.
Now, there's more today to love.
Welcome to Today All Day.
Get more extended interviews.
That's impressive, Chance.
More solutions.
Does it have to say antibacterial?
More must-see moments all day. So join us today, all day. Stream for free on today.com and Peacock.
Need your true crime fix on the go? Dateline episodes are available as podcasts. Mysteries with a twist from the True Crime Original. Wow. Listen to Dateline wherever you get your podcasts.
Right now on NBC News Now.
Here in Chicago, about 20,000 middle schoolers returning to school today.
They also took advantage of existing vaccine distribution networks throughout Alaska.
For breaking news in our changing world, download the NBC News app.
Are we vaccinating right now to keep ahead of these mutant strains?
We still have a demand that far exceeds supply.
He's the first African-American crew member on an extended mission on the International Space Station.
To be able to see someone that looks like them, that is super important.
Perhaps the most successful gospel artist today.
Where you're going is a lot bigger than where you've been.
I am looking forward to seeing you in Tokyo.
Thank you, Today Show family. Love you guys.
Love you back.
Now, we begin with the dawn of a new day in Washington.
Mr. President, you've been aspiring to this office for your whole career.
We're looking at vaccination manufacturing to nearly double over the course of the next month.
I just want to show you what's happening right now. They're making their way up the steps of the U.S. Capitol.
Our team of correspondents is here.
Tonight, the accelerated vaccination timetable as more states lift COVID restrictions. Is it your expectation that you can adapt to any variants out there? The president is talking about winning over some Republicans. Where might he compromise? Is there a chance people could be dealing with long-lasting symptoms for the rest of their lives? Those delivering kindness while fighting hunger in this pandemic.
How are you today?
Very grateful, believe me.
NBC Nightly News with Lester Holt. For breaking news in our changing world, download the NBC News app.
You're watching NBC News Now.
The pace is accelerating to get vaccine doses into arms.
The hope is using advanced robotics to try to scale up to doing thousands of samples.
Back now with our breaking news coverage of an incident at the U.S. Capitol that happened around 1 o'clock Eastern today, where someone rammed into 2 U.S. Capitol police officers with the blue car you see on your screen here before jumping out of that car with a knife, as we were told by U.S. Capitol Police, and being shot That person died as a result of their injuries, and one of the two Capitol police officers who were hit with the car has also died, we understand, at this point. Leanne Caldwell, our Capitol Hill correspondent, is on the ground for us with some new information. Leanne, what can you tell us?
Hey, Aaron. That's right. There is some breaking news, and they have now identified the person, the suspect, who crashed their car into the Capitol. Our colleagues Pete Williams, Tom Winter, and Jonathan Dines say that law enforcement officials briefed on the investigation say the person is Noah Green, is his name, and he is a 25-year-old male from Indiana. Of course, we also know that he was killed today after he crashed his car into that metal car barrier. He got out wielding a knife, and the chief police, the Capitol Police Chief Pittman said that he had lunged toward officers, and that is when shots were fired, and that is how he was killed. So the suspect has now been identified as a 25-year-old from Indiana, and so that is some very new news that we have in this horrible, horrible situation, Aaron.
Leanne, I do want to ask you to back up for us. I know that you've been there at the Capitol at the Capitol complex anyway, for most of the day today. And this, for us, started with your notice that there had been a notice sent out to folks who are normally in the building there. Set the scene for us from 1 o'clock-ish this afternoon from where you were in the Capitol complex.
That's right, Aaron. I was here today, and actually at about 12:50, I had walked past this very exact spot to get to our camera location in the Russell Rotunda. And I was actually going on television with our colleague on our sister network, MSNBC, with Chuck Todd on his show. And right before, it was about 1:03, there was a announcement through the loudspeakers for all staff and all people who are in the office that they are on lockdown because of an exterior situation that they were not naming. Shortly after, we heard the sirens come. After I got off of television, when I was talking about an infrastructure bill, went to the windows where we could see all of the first responders' presence up and down Constitution Avenue behind me. A helicopter came and landed on the east front of the Capitol. There's a green lawn there that separates the Capitol from the Supreme Court and the Library of Congress, to give our viewers a little bit of understanding of where we are. A helicopter landed there. And so this all happened around 1:03, 1:05 p.m., and it was very quick. And so this is the remnants of what happened. We've been getting more and more details since then, now that we know that a Capitol police officer has died today. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi has ordered the flags at the Capitol to be lowered to half staff in honor of him. But I want to also say that things have been so much different around here as far as security is concerned after January 6th, and that is one of the reasons why this is also so heightened. Of course, the loss of life is critical at any moment, but this comes on the heels of a very horrible day, this insurrection on January 6th, where a Capitol police officer, Brian Sicknick, had died, where two police officers after that had taken their lives because of it. And the Capitol Police have just had such a tough time. They have been working so hard, so many long hours to keep up with the security demands. I talk to Capitol Police a lot coming in and out of the building. I've gotten to know some of them. And right after January 6th, they were working 18-hour days, 6 days a week. That has slowly been decreased, but they're still on 12-hour shifts, 6 days a week. They hardly get any time off. There's just so many demands on them physically to be here for their job. And they are also simultaneously having having to process what happened to them on January 6th, something that many of them have struggled to do and haven't had time to do, as they don't get a lot of time away from here. The morale has been extremely low. There was a report out by retired Lieutenant General Honore that Speaker Pelosi had commissioned that said that they had worked tens of thousands of hours of overtime Capitol Police in the past year because they have been understaffed and underprepared. So this is just such a very, very difficult day. I can't even underscore how hard this is for this police force who has just been through so much this year. Yeah. Aaron.
Leanne Caldwell for us. Leanne, thank you. I do want to, I think we still have Frank Figluzzi with us, MSNBC, NBC News national security analyst, who's been watching this story unfold with us. Frank, I'll note that sources have told NBC News through Pete Williams that the driver has been identified as 25-year-old Noah Green of Indiana, and that he may have some ties to that region around Washington, D.C., Maryland, Virginia. Obviously, Noah Green of Indiana doesn't do a whole lot for regular folks trying to do a Google search, but that level, even that little bit of information for the FBI, which would have a key role in figuring out who this guy is and what he's about, I would imagine even such a common name and that little bit of information would be the key to open a lot about who this person is.
Oh, yeah, that's more than enough to trigger a significant investigative response. Even as we speak, I am certain from my past experience that there are FBI vehicles at least sitting outside the home or suspected home of Noah Green of Indiana. It's enough for them to start drafting search warrants for various residents that he might be associated with. And it's clearly enough to start running that name through all databases of all kinds, not only law enforcement, but U.S. intelligence and even foreign intelligence allies who will run the name for us and see if he's in their system or has ever come up before in any capacity. They'll be looking at past employment, whether or not he's in a system, for example, the National Instant Check System that's used when you check someone for purchasing a weapon, because that system also includes certain adjudicated mental health issues that might preclude someone from getting a gun. All of that, as we speak, is being checked right now.
All right, Frank, thank you for that. I think we still have Monica Albert with us as well. And Monica, I do want to check back one more time. I know we've been waiting to hear something from the White House. You've been keeping an eye on that. As we've already heard from, obviously, the Capitol Police Chief. We have, you see in the video there, the D.C. Metropolitan Police Department's chief, who spoke a little bit earlier during this news conference. And we've heard from, via statements and via Twitter and such, certain members of Congress. Monica, anything new to add from the White House perspective?
Not yet, Aaron, and my eyes are really glued to my phone in terms of monitoring for any email or tweets. And I think something to consider here is that it is Good Friday on an Easter weekend, and the president is a very devout Catholic. It's possible that given his experience in the last few years on something like the somber moment of 3 p.m. on Good Friday, for any practicing Catholic, he may have been in some services, or we know there is a chapel at Camp David. So I'm speculating there may have been other things that also he was doing that are important to him and his faith. And that is one possible explanation for why we haven't gotten a statement yet. But that really speaks to also the overall situation, which we can remind people the president left the White House about 4 hours ago now. He left in the noon hour to go to Camp David for Easter weekend. And then this incident on Capitol Hill actually happened right around 1 p.m. And so by then, at that point, the president was already at Camp David, where there aren't any reporters or cameras with him, but where he is surrounded by a small group of aides. So we know the White House press secretary, Jen Psaki, has said he's been briefed. He's monitoring everything that has occurred, and then they're going to release a paper statement, they said. But the fact that we don't have that yet just means means they're still working on it, or the president is otherwise occupied or making phone calls. It could be a whole combination of everything that I just mentioned, but it is a notable delay, given we've heard from almost every other major leader, of course, on Capitol Hill at this point, but it's possible the president is waiting for even more information. And again, the one thing that is likely, I think we would expect to see this afternoon, is a White House proclamation that will ask the flags here on the complex to be lowered, which hasn't been issued yet, but that's something else that has to be drafted and put together, which we've seen in the wake of other tragedies and shootings just in the last couple of weeks, Aaron. But this is something where we know the president is engaged. He's learning information behind the scenes, and they're now just making the decisions about the next steps and how to communicate that to the American people. But we do know that the president isn't expected to make any statements on camera since he is at Camp David, at least for today. And we expect he will actually be there through the Easter weekend, returning to the White House sometime on Monday, Aaron.
All right, Monica Alba for us in Washington, near her post at the White House. Monica, as we've been looking at this scene unfold, and we're still looking at live pictures here, obviously, of the car that police have been investigating, the car that rammed the barricade there. And on the other side of the screen, we see National Guard soldiers that are still in position. This is a section of Washington, the federal area in Washington, D.C. This is an area that has still been a bit tense as a result of what happened there on January 6th. And so this sort of posture, you might expect at a time like this, you might expect it to linger, even though we've been told the lockdown is over, the threat has been contained, it no longer exists in this area. But it's this picture sort of speaks to the feeling in the federal district of Washington over the last few months now.
Absolutely, Aaron. You know it so well from living here and covering Washington, and Capitol Hill is actually my backyard. I live in a neighborhood not too far from there. You're used to now really engaging with National Guardsmen who you see on your daily walks, and this is something where actually in the last week or so, so many people were breathing a sigh of relief because the outer perimeter fencing had been brought down and was taken down and removed in a signal the community thought that things were looking up, that after the weeks following January 6th, they could be in a posture where things could be slightly more relaxed, even though, of course, we know all these other security protocols are in place. So the fact that you now have this incident today, and again, there's so much we don't know, and we really have no clue whether this is connected to January 6th, but the security posture is. We can't overstate that enough. The fact that there are so many people and law enforcement responded as quickly as they did is very much estimation and really testament to what happened a couple of months ago. And that's something I think we can expect to continue, though there's debate about what kind of fencing should be made permanent. We know there's, of course, high non-scalable fence around the White House, and that's something that is going to be in place, but even they've been making changes to it over the last few years in response to other security incidents. So does something like today make the case for something more permanent on Capitol Hill? That remains to be seen, and that's a major debate that's going to play out politically among lawmakers. We can expect, some of whom have very strong opinions about what should and shouldn't happen. But the other outstanding thing, Aaron, as it relates to the president, is he's supposed to give a joint address to Congress. That's something typically that presidents do about a month after they're sworn in. That wasn't the case this year for two reasons. The first is that the president has said really his number one priority was getting COVID relief passed. And the second is because of the coronavirus pandemic, they're not quite sure about the logistics of gathering more than 500 lawmakers in one room indoors and the safety and health of that, because as we know from our own reporting, not all members of Congress have been vaccinated yet, and they're not fully protected, even some who've just gotten it in the last few weeks and months. So they're not really sure that it's a good idea to do it. And then on top of that, now you add this security question. In fact, we know also from our own reporting that some of that fencing had remained in place until they knew what date that joint address to Congress was going to be. And then the thinking was after that joint session and that big high-profile event with the president traveling to the Hill, giving that speech, then after that, perhaps then they could remove some of that fencing. That's something that's still up in the air. And given the events of today, it's possible that we could see them either call for more fencing or to extend the timing. But altogether, Aaron, this joint address to Congress could also now they'll really take a different form or be a different speech given the events of this afternoon and the tragic news of the death of that Capitol Police officer.
All right, Monica Alba for us in Washington. Monica, thank you very much for your reporting as we've gone through this afternoon. Again, live look here at Washington, near the U.S. Capitol, where a car now still sits at a barrier after having tried to breach it to reach the Capitol, hitting 2 police officers in the process, killing one of them, the driver dead as well after this incident. I'm Aaron Gilchrist. You're watching NBC News Now.
Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Morgan Radford. We begin with breaking news out of D.C. A suspect rammed a car into a Capitol Hill barricade, and the driver has died from his injuries after being shot by Capitol Police. Now, one of those officers was struck by the suspect's car, and he died. Another officer is injured. And here's what police said about the incident this afternoon.
The suspect rammed his car into 2 of our officers and then hit the north barricade barrier. At such time, the suspect exited the vehicle with a knife in hand. Our officers then engaged that suspect. He did not respond to verbal commands. The suspect did start lunging toward U.S. Capitol Police officers, at which time U.S. Capitol Police officers fired upon the suspect.
Let's bring in NBC News Capitol Hill correspondent Leanne Caldwell. Leanne, set the scene for us. What is it like on the Hill right now? I know that you've been there all day. Tell us what's happening.
Yeah, Morgan. First, I'll start with the immediate, where I am right now. Right behind me is Constitution Avenue, and then you could see the ambulance behind me, and right behind that is the entrance to the Capitol, and that is where the car turned in, hit 2 officers, and crashed into that white metal barrier that we've been seeing on TV throughout the day. This is streets that have previously been closed after January 6th. Constitution Avenue, main thoroughfare in Washington, was inside a outer perimeter put up of security after January 6th. It was just taken down about 2 weeks ago. And so this is new again, that people could drive on this street. And that is why this car was able to access the entrance of the Capitol and so close to the Capitol. Now, remember, previous to January 6th, this had always been open. But the security posture has changed. Of course, we heard the tragic news of the death of the Capitol Police officer. It seems like one of the who succumbed to injuries, Chief Pittman, had said, I was in the Russell. I'm sorry. I'm going to stop right here because there's a tow truck that is coming, and it says it's a DC Metropolitan Police tow truck. And so I'm going to speculate right now and assume that tow truck is perhaps coming to get the car that is crashed, the suspect's car that is crashed. We'll keep an eye on that. But I was here early in the day when this happened. I was in the Russell Senate office building, which is just about 100 yards from me right now, which is where us reporters, we do our TV, our live shots. It overlooks the Capitol. It's very close to the Capitol. It's where senators and their staff have office buildings. And there was an intercom that came out and said that everything was locked down. You could not leave or come in the building because there was an exterior threat. And of course, that exterior threat is what happened today. So it has been another horrible, tragic day up here on Capitol Hill, just, weeks and a couple months after what happened on January 6th. So people were already on edge. People were already unsure of their safety when they come to work. The building, though, is not a lot of people here because Congress is on recess. Of course, it's Good Friday today. They're on their Easter recess this week and even next week. So lawmakers aren't here. Most staff aren't here either. So it's relatively very quiet Good Friday up here on Capitol Hill, where I thought that it was going to be a very quiet and perhaps a short day, but the events obviously had something completely different is how the day turned out.
Right, Leanne, I want to go back to something you spoke about just a moment ago when you drew the comparison to January 6th, and you talked about some of the changing law enforcement presence there. We know that agencies like the ATF were there today. How unusual is it for those other agencies to be present at a time like this?
Yeah, well, when there's an emergency is when they come. But when there's not an emergency, it's usually just the Capitol Police. But after January 6th, of course, the National Guard has been here ever since. The numbers of National Guard troops have decreased dramatically from their height of 25,000 National Guard here during the inauguration, which, of course, was January 20th after January 6th. Those numbers have been decreasing, and that they're at the lowest level now than they have been since January 6th. They won't give us exact numbers, but we can estimating around a few hundred, maybe low thousand, is how many National Guard are still here. The Capitol Police's main backup, main reinforcement, in addition to the National Guard, is the D.C. Metropolitan Police. And they, of course, had a very big presence when they were called on January 6th. And then today here as well, they were also called here today. So this is a place where, of course, security is very, very important, but it's also a place that has been very open to the public. We're in peak tourist season right now. Of course, tourism isn't very high because of COVID, but I've been noticing this week that it's spring break week for a lot of people. I've seen more tourists in D.C. than I have since COVID started, since last March. And so I was starting to think the city is coming back. You know, there's people who are starting to travel again. The cherry blossoms are in peak bloom right now. Usually the Capitol, and this week is packed with people, packed with tourists. But it's not because of COVID, and it's not because of January 6th. So the current events have really, played a huge role in who was here today, definitely, but it's just the start of this conversation over security that began after January 6th, that this incident today is likely once again to probably shift and influence what security is going to look like after this, Morgan.
An incredible series of events. And Leanne, I know you were there earlier in January when things were changing and unfolding. So first of all, stay safe, and thank you for being there and bringing us the latest news. That's our very own Leanne Caldwell there for us today. Right now, I want to bring in NBC News investigations correspondent Tom Winter, who joins me now. Tom, this has been just an incredible 2 days for you and your reporting. We know the suspect has been identified. So what else can you tell us? What do we know about the investigation so far?
So right now, Morgan, as you might suspect, law enforcement officials are poring over the social media account of this individual identified as Noah Green, 25 years of age, originally from Indiana, but has spent most of his recent time in the Virginia area. I'm going to read to you a post that he made on Facebook in the last several weeks. He said, "Peace, friends, family, enemies, and the like. I wanted to give everyone an update as promised. To be honest, these past few years have been tough, and these past few months have been tougher. I have been tried with some of the biggest unimaginable tests in my life. I'm currently now unemployed after I left my job, partly due to afflictions, but ultimately in search of a spiritual journey. I haven't had much to lean on the past few months. I've been faced with fear, hunger, loss of wealth, and diminution of fruit. My faith is one of the only things that has been able to carry me through these times, and my faith is centered on the belief of the Honorable Minister Louis Farrakhan as Jesus, the Messiah, the final divine reminder in our midst." He continues on speaking about Farrakhan and other religious type themes, as well as discussing some of the hardships that he's had, Morgan. I think when we look at this individual, he's obviously gone through a very difficult period, as many people in this country have over the past year, though most people have obviously not driven into a Capitol barricade and then went after officers with a knife, has been explained to us by police officials. So at this point, this person is deceased. Noah Green is deceased. You're seeing the vehicle that is registered to him. And police officers shot him once he, according to police, lunged at them with a knife after crashing into this barricade. At least one U.S. Capitol Police officer is dead, and several others have been injured. And so that's where this case stands at this point. With him being deceased, there obviously will not be a trial. So we'll wait and see what other information we can get, because there is not a trial. Interestingly, we typically get a lot more information because law enforcement is not hesitant to try to have a prejudicial proceeding ahead of it if they were to proceed to a trial. So we should get more information. It should be forthcoming. And obviously, they'll be pouring through his social media accounts. But that's just a synopsis of some of the things that he's posted recently.
Which is interesting, Tom, because that's sort of the only glimpse that we have into his mindset. And, you know, you've covered so many of these stories. When we look back to San Bernardino or Pulse or this, it's almost like these manifestos are the only bit of information we have before these tragedies happen. But we also pay so much attention to the suspects. What about the victims? We know that one Capitol Police officer has died, another was injured. What do we know about those officers, this heroic Capitol Police Department that has been under so much just in the past almost 3 months? What do we know about them?
Well, right now, Morgan, and I appreciate your point, we don't yet know the names of those officers, and there's a good reason for that. They still want to make sure that all the family members that need to be notified are notified. We know at least one U.S. Capitol Police officer died as a result of their injuries that they sustained in this incident. The exact manner that they died is something we're still trying to get some more information on. Some conflicting reports, whether or not they were struck by the vehicle or, in fact, they had been stabbed at some point by the individual, Noah Green. So that's something that we're still trying to work out. Another officer was injured, perhaps a third. So we're still trying to get that information and get some of the specifics. But right now, the Capitol Police, understandably, don't want to put that information out until they make sure all the family members have been notified. Fortunately, it ends there. You brought up a series of attacks where a number of civilians and bystanders were injured. So the good news so far, at least, is that there doesn't appear that there's been anybody else who has been harmed as a result of this crime so far. But obviously, we'll continue to report.
And Tom, just before I let you go, I know this is extremely early and certainly a fluid situation as it's breaking news. But, you know, we got a glimpse, as you mentioned, in reading that Facebook post from his mindset. But do we have any sense of why he went there? Any sense of the motive in terms of place, location, and timing?
Right. So what I read to you gives us a sense of mindset. The question you're asking, the appropriate question you're asking is motive. So what got us from a point of perhaps some personal struggles to getting into a car and trying to ram it into the Capitol and then coming out of the car with a knife? That's obviously a very deliberative action. We don't have that information yet. That's something that's going to require additional interviews. Obviously, they're going to want to speak with his family. They're going to want to speak to his friends. They're going to want to speak with people that knew him over the past several days. Somehow, if he's been using credit cards, track where he's made purchases. Were there recent purchases that were made that could provide some insight as far as what he was thinking and why this happened today? Perhaps, perhaps not. Those are all the types of things that they'll look into. They'll obviously be able, and if they haven't done it already, they'll do it very shortly, have the correct warrant, exigent circumstance type warrants to go after his cell phone records, who's he been calling, who's he been talking to, and that can also provide some information as far as where he's actually physically been over the past several days and weeks. And text message records and other records go back several months. So they'll be able to piece that together. That's not, as we sit here in the East Coast at 4:16 on Friday, going to be something that's done in the next few minutes, but something over the next few days.
All right, Tom Winter, no one gives us quite the insight and details like you, so thank you so much for making time for us this afternoon.
Sure.
Let's go ahead and bring in Jim Cavanaugh right now. He's a retired ATF special agent and NBC News terrorism analyst. Jim, you and I have talked over a series of similar events, and yet this one is no less shocking. The Capitol Police says this does not appear to be terrorism related, but what are investigators going to look at when they're trying to determine the motive that Tom was just describing?
I think, Morgan, you have a big overlay here of suicide. Homicide and suicide, which he killed the Capitol Police officer. He attacked the Capitol Police. So it was homicidal, but it's also suicidal. The Facebook post shows us the despondency. He's lost. He has no food. He's been going hungry. He has no work. He has no future. It sounds like he has nobody supporting him. He's just totally out there. And what does he do? He launches an attack, you know, on the visible place of the United States, democracy. So maybe, I'm not saying for sure. I mean, we'll have to see what the investigators find out. One possibility that he's launched that attack right there at the seat of democracy because it failed him. It failed him in his life. He has nothing. And he's not blaming necessarily his mother or father or friends or relatives, but he's blaming, you know, the nation. And, you know, the suicide rate in this pandemic is awful. And, you know, a lot of Americans have been touched by the suicides in America based on the pandemic. It's so depressing, it's so isolating, it's so debilitating financially, the future looks bleak, you know, the news is so down. And, you know, you get people in a depression and then they take their own life. And I think there's some elements of that here. I mean, it doesn't seem to be, to me, Morgan, that he went to any great effort to try to acquire firearms or explosives, to launch any kind of a planned, you know, mission to do something. Sounds like he got in his car with a knife and he drove over there. So the planning is not very, very extensive in my view. And I think it's an overlay of suicide in this, and he wanted the cops to kill him. He's angry. He's angry. He's angry at everyone. He's angry at everyone. So who do you launch your attack at? Well, the nation. He lives right there. He's living in Virginia. There's the symbol. That's who I'm going after. They're going to kill me. That's it.
And how incredibly unfortunate, because I think some of the things that you're talking about, Jim, I mean, we've seen this pandemic, and of course, you know, suicide rates have gone up, depression rates have gone up, especially among children. We've seen the opioid addiction and epidemic increase, which is the other unspoken piece of this pandemic. So certainly people are being affected, but this is tragic. I mean, this is murderous, right? I mean, this is a situation that has caused people to die. So when you look, for example, about how law enforcement is reacting to this and the fact that they did lift the lockdown, for example, what does that tell you about next steps? Why did they decide to remove the lockdown? Does that say that there's no more threat left?
Yes, Morgan, exactly. Well, they have the Facebook post. They know his behavior, which we've described, the driving the vehicle, attacking the officers. They don't see any other means of a violent major attack. They've got the Facebook post probably indicating a suicidal angle to it. And so they feel that, yes, they can lift the lockdown. I think that's probably the right assessment, too. You know, they have to make those judgments all the time. It's the heroic Capitol Police. And you know, also our facilities police, our university police, our police at, you know, bridges and tunnels. People say, oh, you know, those policemen, you know, they've got it made. They're just at the facility. You know, some of those officers get into most dangerous situations in a modern era, in the last 30 years. You know, it used to be only the city police, you know, that were involved in all the violence and crime and the bank robberies. But it's not like that anymore. Our facilities police across the country, university police, police at hospitals, police at federal buildings, they sometimes are involved in just unbelievable actions of violence. And the Capitol Police is both of those. It's both a city police for the 40 blocks around the Capitol, and it protects the members, so it has a Secret Service type element, and it protects the Capitol grounds. So it has these major missions, and it has to deal with all of them. So what the Congress needs to do is quit the debating, which they're supposed to be good at, but not really, and a lot of talk, and support the Capitol Police. Give them more officers, give them more equipment, give them some security. It doesn't need to be a fortress. I totally agree with that.
I want to jump
security
in there, Jim, when you're talking about this debate that's happening in Congress, because there's also been some debate about taking down the fencing around the Capitol and sending those National Guard troops home. They've been there, of course, since January 6th. Do you think that is the right move? Does that somehow change the equation?
No, that's the right move. We don't need that fence around the Capitol, and we don't need all those National Guardsmen standing there. That's not the right move. That's fighting the last war, which is the January 6th insurrection, which is not going to happen again without a whole lot of notice. That took a president who was telling a big lie, who was egging them on, who was directing them, all of his supporters, members that were speaking out like this crazy talk that built up over months. you're going to see that coming. You don't need all that. That's just going to make it worse. So that's not what we need. What we need is Capitol Police to be fully staffed and maybe more staffing, because they got to protect the members afar as well. Smart technology, which we have, that can help us, keep crowds away and keep people back, and do the smart things that keep the Capitol open but more people protected. Listen to the law enforcement, and get that Capitol Police Board with the 2 sergeants at arms and the architect of the Capitol trying to oversee the chief. That's no good. That's not going to work. It doesn't work in an emergency. So you got to change that structure. You got to have the right leadership in there. They can do all that, Morgan, but they need to do it. They need to make
Jim,
the positive steps.
I want to ask you, we have to go to break in just a minute, but just very briefly, I can't let you go without asking. A lot of us, when we saw what happened on January 6th, wondered, was this the end of the beginning or the beginning of the end? Because we've been seeing this rise in extremism across the nation and these extreme acts, right? Do you think that what we saw on January 6th and now more recently what we saw today is part of a larger pattern that we will have to expect to see more of?
Yes, it is more the beginning of the problem, but the problem will be different. It's not going to be an insurrection at the Capitol.
How so?
It's going to be more, it'll be more, lone wolf style attacks in the year ahead. What's damped that down, I think, is the FBI's aggressive posture and the U.S. Attorney's Office of going out and arrested 300, 400 of these false patriots. They've gone out and got them. They've put them in jail. The federal judiciary has been excellent. They've not given them bond if they're violent, if they've been, known to go out and commit violence. The judges have a tough role, and they've been doing a great job. And these people need a fair trial. But if they're convicted of these violence against the United States government, insurrection, inciting insurrection, they need to go to prison. That is the thing that will damp it down the best. But we're in a year now where picture's not quite clear. I'm surprised we haven't seen some barricades against the FBI trying to arrest some of these people, some shootouts, some fugitives, and that may still yet come from some of the insurrectionists that they're trying to get. But I wouldn't be surprised if we see a bombing or two. We saw the 2 pipe bombs on Capitol Hill. Those arrests have not been made yet. So it's morphed, Morgan. It's a different threat.
A different type of threat.
Actors, different tactical threat, the same actors. So it's going to be a little more amorphous, a little more across the country. Danger to the members, threats to the members, and all political leaders. I think that's really out there, and it's not going away.
And it certainly has people on high alert. Jim, I can't thank you enough for your perspective. It's what we needed to hear today. Jim Kavanaugh, thank you so much for being with us. And stay tuned right here to NBC News Now.